Friends, if you are in the mood for a film that is filled with passion, tension, and emotional chaos, then you absolutely have to check out Unfaithful, 2002. And if you're visiting our channel for the very first time, don't forget to subscribe because today we're diving deep into a movie that has left audiences talking for years. In this video, we'll explore everything you need to know about Unfaithful, what it's about, where you can watch it, the story behind its making, and why it continues to be one of the most gripping romantic thrillers of its time. This movie isn't just another love story. It's a journey into human emotions, temptation, and the dark consequences of desire. We'll discuss how the story unfolds, who the main characters are, and how each scene pulls you deeper into its world. From the subtle looks and secret meetings to the shocking twists that will leave you stunned, Unfaithful manages to blend romance, suspense, and tragedy in a way that few films can. We'll also take a close look at the technical department. How the film was shot, the camera work, lighting, and cinematography that perfectly capture the tension between love and guilt. The music plays a huge role in building the emotional tone, so we'll talk about the soundtrack and how it adds to the mood of every scene. You'll learn about how the film was developed from pre-production all the way through post-production, and how every department worked together to create such a polished final product. And of course, we can't skip the cast. The incredible performances that make this movie unforgettable. Diane Lane delivers one of her most powerful performances as Connie, a woman caught between the comfort of her marriage and the thrill of forbidden love. Richard Gere plays her husband, giving a performance full of quiet intensity and heartbreak, while Olivier Martinez shines as the mysterious and dangerously charming lover. We'll discuss how each actor fit into their role, what emotions they brought to the screen, and how their chemistry made the film come alive. We'll also go through the budget and box office numbers to see how the film performed commercially, along with some interesting facts you might not know, like where it was filmed, what inspired the director, and how the story differs from the French film it was based on. There's so much to unpack here, from the behind-the-scenes challenges to the critical reactions and audience responses that made Unfaithful such a talked-about film even decades later. So friends, stay with me till the end of this video because I'm going to tell you everything, from where you can watch Unfaithful 2002, on streaming or TV, to what makes this movie a must-see for anyone who loves suspenseful storytelling and deep emotional drama. We'll uncover every fascinating detail, every twist, and every layer of this intense film experience. So, without wasting any more time, let's start the video and dive right into the world of Unfaithful 2002. The story of Unfaithful 2002 unfolds like a slow-burning fuse, drawing you in with quiet intimacy before it explodes into emotional chaos. It begins in the calm suburbs of New York, where Connie and Edward Sumner live what seems to be the perfect life. They have a beautiful house, a loving marriage, and a son who completes their picture of domestic bliss. Their days are predictable, their lives structured, and everything appears stable. But right from the start, there's an undercurrent of restlessness in Connie's world, a kind of quiet dissatisfaction that she doesn't even fully understand herself. This emotional restlessness becomes the seed from which the entire story grows. One windy afternoon, Connie travels into Manhattan for errands. It's here, in the middle of a chaotic, blustery day, that fate intervenes. She collides, quite literally, with a handsome stranger, Paul Martel, and that single moment changes everything. The way the film captures their first meeting feels cinematic yet natural. Books fall, papers scatter, and time seems to slow as their eyes meet. There's no dramatic music or exaggerated gestures, just a spark of curiosity that lingers long after Connie leaves. But fate, as it always does in such stories, gives them another chance to meet, and this time Connie finds herself drawn into Paul's world, a small, cluttered apartment filled with books, art, and charm. At first, their interactions are casual, innocent even. Connie tells herself it's harmless, just conversation. But the film lets us see the gradual shift, the way her laughter lingers a little too long, the way her hand hesitates when she reaches for the door to leave. Director Adrian Lyne doesn't rush the seduction. He lets it unfold with realism and tension. Each encounter builds a layer of emotional and physical intimacy, and before long, Connie is completely swept up in an affair that she both desires and despises. The storytelling here is fascinating because it doesn't rely on melodrama. Instead, it builds emotion through details. The sound of footsteps on a staircase, the nervous way Connie adjusts her hair, the guilt that flashes across her face when she returns home to her husband and son. The film's middle act is where everything intensifies. Connie's two worlds, her suburban family life and her secret affair, start to collide in subtle, painful ways. The lies grow heavier, the excuses more fragile. We see her guilt eating away at her, but also the addiction to the thrill she can't seem to let go of. There's a sense of inevitability, like watching a glass tower slowly crack. The brilliance of the narrative lies in how it shows the emotional duality of Connie's experience. Her exhilaration in Paul's arms and her heartbreak at what she's risking. It's not just about infidelity. It's about how human beings try to fill the emptiness they can't name. Then comes Edward's growing suspicion. Richard Gere's performance transforms Edward from a calm, loving husband into a man unraveling under the weight of doubt. He senses something is wrong long before he has proof. His discovery is one of the film's key turning points. When he finally learns the truth, through a small, devastating clue, the entire tone of the movie shifts. The focus turns from Connie's emotional storm to Edward's inner breakdown. The storytelling becomes quieter, heavier. Instead of loud confrontations, we get silent dinners, tense stares, and moments where the air feels so thick you can almost feel it pressing down. And then, in a shocking moment of passion and rage, Edward's heartbreak turns violent. It's one of the most unforgettable scenes in the film, not because of its brutality, but because of how human it feels. There's no planning, no rational thought, just a split-second reaction born from love, anger, and betrayal colliding all at once. The film doesn't treat this act as a twist, but as a tragic consequence of emotions spiraling out of control. From that point on, the story becomes even more haunting. The affair that once felt exciting and forbidden now feels heavy with guilt and fear. The final act slows the pace, mirroring the emotional weight that has settled over the characters. Connie and Edward are now trapped in the aftermath of their own choices, bound together by secrets they can't escape. Their once bright home now feels cold and distant. The narrative builds a quiet tension as they both realize that what they've lost is not just trust, but the very foundation of their lives. The storytelling remains linear, but emotionally, it moves in circles, revisiting moments of tenderness, guilt, and longing, showing how every action echoes endlessly in their relationship. What makes Unfaithful so compelling is that it doesn't rely on time jumps, flashbacks, or non-linear tricks. The power of its story comes from its simplicity and realism. It follows a straight path, but every step feels charged with emotional electricity. Each scene deepens the character's humanity rather than pushing the plot forward for the sake of drama. The turning points don't arrive with fanfare. They sneak up, disguised as small decisions that end up changing everything. By the end, Unfaithful leaves you not with answers, but with emotions. The story begins with a perfect life and ends with a haunting silence. Yet what happens in between feels like watching love itself unravel, thread by thread. The narrative flows like a storm, calm at first, then wild and uncontrollable, and finally, eerily quiet once it passes. It's a story about choices, consequences, and the dangerous fragility of desire, told with patience, intensity, and a deep understanding of human nature. The characters in Unfaithful 2002 aren't just players in a story, they are the story. Every moment, every decision, every flicker of emotion in their eyes drives the narrative forward. This film thrives on human complexity, and its characters feel less like scripted figures and more like real people caught in an emotional storm they never expected to face. It's not about good versus bad or right versus wrong. It's about desire, guilt, and the fragile balance between love and betrayal. The beauty of Unfaithful lies in how it allows its characters to change slowly, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly, they're not who they used to be anymore. Connie Sumner, played by Diane Lane, stands at the heart of the film's emotional turmoil. She begins as the embodiment of suburban comfort, a loving mother, devoted wife, and seemingly content woman living a peaceful life in the New York suburbs. But from the very first scenes, there's a quiet tension inside her, a restlessness that bubbles under her calm surface. She's surrounded by the warmth of family, yet there's something unspoken missing. A spark, a thrill, a reminder that she's more than just a wife and mother. The brilliance of Diane Lane's performance is in how she expresses that longing without words. You can see it in the way she pauses, in her distracted stares out the window, in how she clings to small bursts of excitement like she's trying to remember what passion used to feel like. When she meets Paul Martel, the young French bookseller, her transformation begins. The moment she steps into his apartment, a space filled with art, mystery, and sensuality, it's as if she's walking into another version of herself. Paul represents freedom, danger, and temptation all at once. He's spontaneous where her husband is methodical, unpredictable where her life has been routine. Connie's affair doesn't start as rebellion. It starts as curiosity, a need to feel alive again. But soon, curiosity becomes addiction. Her every visit to Paul is charged with the thrill of danger and the guilt of betrayal. What's most fascinating is how her body language shifts. She laughs more freely, her movements become lighter, yet her eyes grow heavier with guilt. It's a slow emotional metamorphosis that makes her both relatable and heartbreaking. She becomes a woman torn in two, one part craving the rush of forbidden love, the other suffocating under the weight of her choices. Edward Sumner, portrayed by Richard Gere, undergoes one of the most quietly devastating character transformations in the film. In the beginning, Edward is the picture of stability, successful in his career, dependable as a father, loving as a husband. He is calm, gentle, and deeply invested in his family. His love for Connie feels genuine, even if it's settled into the comfort of routine. But as Connie starts slipping away emotionally, Edward senses it. His unease builds slowly, expressed not through shouting or confrontation, but through subtle moments of silence, glances, and hesitation. The heartbreak of his character is that he doesn't want to believe what he suspects. He clings to denial until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. When Edward finally discovers the affair, everything changes. The scene of realization is one of the film's most intense emotional moments. There's no explosion, no dramatic outburst, just quiet devastation. You can almost feel his world collapsing inside him. Gere plays this transformation with haunting restraint, showing how grief can turn into rage, and love can twist into something uncontrollable. The violent act that follows isn't a moment of evil. It's a moment of humanity breaking apart under too much pain. Edward's transformation is tragic because it's not a journey toward growth or redemption. It's a descent into the darker side of love, the kind that destroys even when it means to protect. Paul Martel, brought to life by Olivier Martinez, is less a traditional character and more a symbol of everything forbidden. He's the spark that ignites the story and the chaos that follows. On the surface, Paul is charming, cultured, and irresistible. His European charisma and mysterious aura make him the perfect contrast to Connie's predictable suburban life. But beneath his charm lies ambiguity. Does he truly love Connie, or is he simply enjoying the power he has over her? The film never fully answers this, which makes him even more fascinating. He's not portrayed as a villain. He's more like temptation personified. Paul represents everything exciting and dangerous about breaking the rules. His life is transient and passionate, and when Connie enters it, she becomes intoxicated by his world. He awakens something in her that she didn't realize she had buried, but that awakening comes with a cost. Paul's character doesn't evolve much, but that's intentional. He's the catalyst for everyone else's transformation. He sets off a chain of emotional explosions that he can't control and doesn't survive. The relationships between these three characters are like a web, each connection tugging and tightening until the strands begin to snap. Connie and Edward's marriage transforms from comfortable to suffocating. Their love doesn't vanish, but it becomes warped by suspicion, guilt, and fear. What's remarkable is how the film captures their dynamic through silence rather than arguments. A glance across the dinner table, a quiet car ride, or a lingering touch says more than any confession could. Their relationship becomes a study in emotional distance, the kind that grows quietly until it's impossible to ignore. Connie's relationship with Paul, on the other hand, is pure fire. It's passion without foundation, excitement without safety. Every moment between them feels urgent, reckless, and doomed. She's drawn to him not just physically but emotionally, because he makes her feel seen. Yet, as the affair deepens, the thrill begins to rot into fear. Every secret meeting becomes heavier, every kiss tinged with the shadow of guilt. By the time things spiral out of control, Connie's passion has turned into panic. Her evolution from thrill-seeker to guilt-ridden soul is the emotional backbone of the story. By the film's end, all three characters are completely transformed. Connie has gone from restless to remorseful, from a woman chasing excitement to one haunted by its consequences. Edward, once calm and rational, becomes tormented by the burden of his choices. And Paul, once the symbol of temptation, becomes the ghost that lingers over both of them. The film doesn't offer redemption or closure. It leaves the characters suspended in the gray space between love and destruction. The brilliance of the character development in Unfaithful lies in its realism. No one is painted as good or bad. Connie's affair isn't portrayed as simple betrayal. It's an emotional awakening that turns into a nightmare. Edward's reaction isn't just jealousy. It's the raw, uncontrollable pain of someone whose trust has been shattered. Every character is both right and wrong at different moments, and that's what makes them unforgettable. Their motivations are deeply human. The need to feel wanted, the fear of losing love, the instinct to protect, and the regret that follows every bad decision. Each character's transformation shapes the story's emotional landscape. Connie's longing drives the plot forward, Edward's heartbreak reshapes it, and Paul's presence destabilizes everything. Together, they create a tragic triangle of desire, guilt, and consequence that feels both intimate and universal. The performances in Unfaithful, 2002, form the emotional backbone of the entire film. Without the astonishing work of its leads, the story might have been just another tale of suburban infidelity. But here, every look, every hesitation, every breath feels charged with meaning. The cast doesn't just act. They embody their characters so fully that it's easy to forget you're watching actors. Director Adrian Lyne gives his performers the room to breathe, to let emotions linger, and to allow silence to speak louder than words. And that's exactly where the film finds its power. Diane Lane's portrayal of Connie Sumner is nothing short of mesmerizing. She doesn't present Connie as a villain or a victim, but as a deeply human woman wrestling with desires that terrify and thrill her in equal measure. Lane's performance begins quietly, with small, almost invisible gestures that reveal the restlessness under Connie's seemingly perfect suburban life. There's something in her gaze in the early scenes, a flicker of longing, a subtle fatigue with routine, that tells us her happiness is fragile. When she first meets Paul Martel, played by Olivier Martinez, Lane communicates an entire emotional storm without a single line of dialogue. A half smile, a pause, a nervous laugh. Each movement captures the instant, dangerous pull of attraction. What makes Lane's performance extraordinary is how layered it is. She doesn't portray passion as simple lust. It's mixed with confusion, guilt, and fear. The scenes between her and Martinez pulse with intensity, but it's her reactions afterward that truly define her acting. The guilt that follows her moments of pleasure feels suffocating. She plays these contradictions so truthfully that viewers can see every emotion flicker across her face like shifting light. Her famous train scene, where she recalls moments of intimacy while fighting back tears, stands as one of the most brilliant pieces of nonverbal acting in modern cinema. It's sensual, tragic, and entirely human. Lane manages to capture the thrill of desire and the agony of self-betrayal in one seamless emotional rhythm. As the affair deepens and the lies begin to unravel, Lane's performance transforms again. She becomes increasingly fragile, her calm suburban mask cracking under the weight of her secret. Her voice softens, her movements grow more erratic, her eyes dart with fear and shame. By the time her husband begins to suspect the truth, Lane turns Connie into a portrait of quiet panic. Yet even in her guilt, there's compassion. You can still feel her love for her family. That duality is what makes her portrayal unforgettable. She's not a woman who stops loving her husband. She's a woman who loses control of the balance between desire and morality. Lane's performance never asks for forgiveness, but it demands empathy. She gives Connie a soul, and that's why her character lingers long after the credits roll. Richard Gere, as Edward Sumner, delivers one of the most restrained and devastating performances of his career. Gere's Edward is not an explosive man by nature. He's composed, intelligent, and emotionally grounded. He embodies the image of the dependable husband, warm, slightly distant, but devoted to his family. At first, Gere plays Edward with quiet contentment, suggesting a man who believes his life is safe and stable. But as subtle cracks begin to form, missed calls, unusual behavior, unease in Connie's eyes, Gere shifts his tone. His line delivery becomes slower, his silences longer, and his glances sharper. You can see his character analyzing, processing, trying not to believe the truth he senses coming. The brilliance of Gere's performance lies in his restraint. He doesn't overplay his suspicion or his pain. He lets it simmer beneath the surface. This subtlety makes his emotional explosion later in the film all the more shattering. When he discovers undeniable proof of Connie's affair, Gere's reaction is chilling in its quietness. He doesn't shout or rage immediately. He freezes. You can see his entire emotional foundation collapse behind his eyes. The man who has always relied on control suddenly loses it in the most human way possible. His subsequent outburst, driven by heartbreak, anger, and disbelief, feels frighteningly real, not because of the violence itself, but because of the emotion that fuels it. Gere captures a man whose love turns into grief in real time, and the result is both tragic and unforgettable. What's equally powerful is how Gere portrays Edward after the turning point. Once the deed is done, he becomes hollowed, as though the light inside him has gone out. He spends long stretches of the film barely speaking, lost in thought, consumed by guilt. Gere plays these moments with remarkable vulnerability. His hands shake slightly. His eyes carry the weight of both betrayal and remorse. It's a performance built on subtlety and humanity, showing that heartbreak can destroy even the most composed man. It's one of Gere's finest dramatic turns, an emotionally precise and haunting study of a husband's pain. Olivier Martinez brings magnetic charisma to the role of Paul Martel, the enigmatic lover who sets the story in motion. Martinez doesn't just play Paul as a seducer. He crafts him as a mystery. His confidence is quiet, his charm natural, his allure effortless. The moment he appears on screen, there's an undeniable chemistry with Lane. It's not forced, not loud, but charged with dangerous energy. Paul's apartment, filled with books and art, becomes an extension of his personality. Cultured, passionate, slightly dangerous. Martinez uses that setting to full advantage, moving through it like a cat who knows his territory. What's compelling about Martinez's performance is that he doesn't make Paul manipulative or evil. He's not the villain, he's a catalyst. His scenes reveal glimpses of tenderness and loneliness, suggesting a man who uses passion to fill his own emptiness. There's a moment when Connie tries to pull away, and Paul's expression shifts from playful to quietly wounded. It's in those tiny gestures that Martinez gives Paul depth. His stillness makes him alluring, but it's the vulnerability beneath that makes him human. The chemistry between him and Lane burns throughout the film, but what keeps their scenes gripping is the emotional contrast. Her turmoil versus his calm, her guilt versus his ease. Martinez understands that the most dangerous seduction is the one that feels effortless, and he performs it flawlessly. Even the supporting cast deserves praise for grounding the story in reality. Eric Pursullivan, as the Sumners' young son Charlie, brings innocence and warmth to the otherwise turbulent emotional landscape. His scenes remind viewers of what's truly at stake, a family on the verge of collapse. Margaret Collin, as Connie's friend, adds small but meaningful touches of normalcy, providing moments of contrast that make Connie's double life feel all the more precarious. These brief performances work like quiet reminders of the real world pressing against Connie's secret one. Together, the trio of Lane, Gere, and Martinez creates a magnetic triangle of emotion. Every interaction between them feels alive with tension. When Gere and Lane share scenes, there's love and suspicion tangled together, communicated through the smallest gestures. A glance, a pause, a trembling breath. Adrian Lyne's direction in Unfaithful, 2002, is the film's emotional compass, shaping not just what we see but how we feel. He has a gift for transforming simple domestic moments into psychological battlegrounds. From the opening frames, his touch is subtle yet deliberate, setting a tone that feels both intimate and uneasy. Lyne doesn't rely on flashy editing or excessive dialogue. Instead, he builds tension through the quiet rhythm of everyday life, through what isn't said, and through the spaces between people. He crafts a visual language where every room, every glance, and every movement tells its own story. His direction pulls you into the private world of the characters, making you feel like you're watching something you shouldn't, and that sense of voyeurism is what makes the film so thrilling and unsettling. Lyne begins by painting the suburban world of the Sumners with soft, natural light and calm composition. The camera observes rather than interferes, creating a sense of normalcy so strong that when the story begins to twist, the disruption feels personal. He frames the family home as a space of routine and quiet affection. Sunlight through kitchen windows, gentle laughter, shared dinners. But as Connie's secret life begins, Lyne slowly shifts this balance. The lighting grows more muted, shadows creep into previously safe spaces, and the once inviting house starts to feel like a cage. The pacing mirrors this emotional descent. Early scenes flow gently, almost leisurely, but as Connie's desire deepens, the rhythm changes. The edits become sharper, the camera movements more fluid and restless, echoing her inner turmoil. Lyne is a master of the slow burn. He understands that the power of a story like Unfaithful lies not in the act itself, but in the moments leading up to it and the quiet fallout that follows. Instead of showing passion as a burst of energy, he builds it through repetition and restraint. When Connie first meets Paul Martel, Lyne frames the encounter like a dance. The camera lingers, not on the words exchanged, but on body language. The way she hesitates before entering his apartment, the nervous laughter, the stolen glances. Every shot feels deliberate, creating a rhythm of temptation. The affair is filmed with a sense of intimacy that borders on discomfort. Lyne wants the audience to feel complicit, to feel the weight of Connie's choices as if they were their own. He achieves this by using the camera as a silent observer. Never too close, never too distant. Just close enough to make us feel the heat of what's happening and the guilt that follows. One of Lyne's boldest stylistic choices is his use of silence. He resists the urge to fill emotional moments with dialogue or music. Instead, he lets the audience sit in the tension. A pause between two sentences, the quiet of a car ride, or the creak of a floorboard becomes louder than any score could ever be. These silences make the emotions tangible. You don't just watch the character's discomfort, you experience it. When Connie rides the train after being with Paul, Lyne lets the moment unfold without words, relying only on Diane Lane's expressions and the rhythm of the train. It's one of the most memorable sequences in the film, a perfect example of Lyne's confidence in visual storytelling. He trusts the audience to read the character's soul without being told what to feel. The contrast between settings is another example of his directorial precision. The suburban home is shot with static frames and symmetrical balance, emphasizing control and order. Paul's apartment in Manhattan, on the other hand, is filmed with handheld movements and warm, flickering light. It feels alive, unpredictable, and dangerous. The color palette shifts between these worlds, the cool blues and pale tones of home versus the deep reds and golden hues of Paul's space. Lyne uses this visual language to map Connie's psychological journey. Each time she returns home after being with Paul, the lighting feels slightly colder, the camera more distant, as if the comfort of home is slipping away. By the time Edward begins to suspect the affair, even the suburban world feels corrupted by shadows and silence. Lyne's attention to detail extends beyond visuals to pacing. He understands that desire, guilt, and rage all move at different speeds. The early scenes breathe slowly, drawing us into the illusion of normal life. The middle acts pulse with restless energy, mimicking the dangerous thrill of the affair. And once the secret is out, the film slows again, heavy with dread and regret. This control of tempo is what gives the story its emotional rhythm. It's never static, always moving in tune with the characters' hearts. Lyne doesn't manipulate time in a non-linear way, but he manipulates emotional time, stretching moments of tension and shrinking moments of release to keep viewers trapped in the same anxiety as the characters. Shot composition in Unfaithful is its own form of storytelling. Lyne often frames characters through barriers, windows, mirrors, doorways, as if they're already imprisoned by their choices. Reflections play a major role. Connie often appears doubled in mirrors or glass, symbolizing her divided self. When Edward begins to suspect her, Lyne uses distance and framing to show the growing emotional gap between them. Shots where they share the same space but never the same frame, or where one is in focus while the other blurs into the background. These choices communicate everything about their marriage without a word. Even everyday objects, a gift, a photo, a snow globe, are given symbolic weight, reminding us that love and guilt can inhabit the same space. The tone Lyne creates is one of constant unease. There's no loud announcement when things go wrong. The shift happens gradually. He uses weather and environment as emotional cues, windy days, sudden rain, dimming light, to mirror internal storms. The film's atmosphere feels almost tactile, like the air itself changes with Connie's mood. When passion blooms, everything feels warm and close. When guilt takes over, the light becomes harsh and cold. Lyne's background in atmospheric filmmaking, seen in his earlier works like Fatal Attraction and 9.5 Weeks, shows through here, but Unfaithful feels quieter, more mature, more inward-looking. He replaces shock value with emotional precision. When the story finally reaches its breaking point, Lyne stages it with brutal simplicity. The confrontation between Edward and Paul isn't stylized. It's raw and real. There's no fast editing, no dramatic score. The violence happens in silence, shocking not because it's graphic but because it feels like an eruption of everything unsaid. Lyne shoots it in long takes, forcing the audience to stay with the moment instead of cutting away. It's uncomfortable and human, the kind of scene that leaves a lasting echo. Afterward, the film slows to a haunting crawl. The camera lingers on the aftermath, the silence, the shock, the unspoken horror, and the pacing mirrors the numbness of guilt. Lyne allows the emotion to settle, refusing to provide relief. Throughout the film, Lyne's direction maintains an elegant balance between passion and restraint. He never tells us how to judge the characters. He doesn't condemn Connie or glorify Edward. Instead, he observes them with empathy, showing that love, desire, and betrayal often coexist in the same heart. His camera becomes a psychological lens, revealing the complexities that words could never capture. The cinematography in Unfaithful, 2002, is one of the film's most powerful storytelling tools. It doesn't just capture the scenes, it interprets them. Every camera angle, lighting choice, and frame composition becomes an emotional language, translating the inner lives of the characters into visual poetry. Cinematographer Peter Bijou, who worked closely with director Adrian Lyne, crafts a world that feels both real and dreamlike, familiar yet suffocating. He uses the camera not just as a witness but as an emotional participant, quietly observing, seducing, and sometimes accusing. The result is a film where every shot seems to pulse with the same tension that consumes its characters. The film opens with a palette of calm suburban light. The Sumner's home is filmed with soft, even illumination, muted blues, pale whites, and gentle shadows that evoke security and routine. The camera is steady, the composition's symmetrical. Everything feels balanced, in control. It's the kind of lighting that belongs to a peaceful, predictable life. But that balance is deceptive. As Connie's restlessness begins to surface, the cinematography subtly shifts. The lighting becomes slightly dimmer, the shadows a little longer, and the camera begins to move differently. The world that once seemed safe starts to feel too clean, too still, almost sterile. The light that once comforted her begins to expose her unease. When Connie steps into Paul Martel's world, the visual tone transforms completely. The cinematography breathes differently in these scenes. Warmer, darker, more tactile. Paul's loft is bathed in golden and amber tones, often lit by practical lamps and filtered sunlight through curtains or blinds. This lighting gives the scenes a sense of intimacy and secrecy, like the world outside doesn't exist. The difference between her home and his apartment is striking. The suburban house is open and overlit. The city loft is shadowy, enclosed, and sensual. These environments visually represent the two sides of Connie's life, the safety of routine versus the danger of passion. The lighting seduces her long before Paul does. Camera movement plays a crucial role in shaping the film's emotional rhythm. Early scenes at home are often shot with static frames or slow dolly moves, suggesting the predictability of Connie's daily life. When she meets Paul, the camera begins to move with a quiet energy. Handheld shots and tracking movements appear more frequently, mirroring the instability of her emotions. The affair sequences are alive with fluid camera work. The lens glides around the actors, tracing their proximity, following the physical and psychological dance between desire and restraint. This mobility creates a sense of being caught inside Connie's experience. Each touch, glance, and hesitation feels magnified. One of the most memorable examples of Lyne and Bijoux visual storytelling is the famous train scene. After an encounter with Paul, Connie sits alone on the train, her face a battlefield of emotion. Joy, guilt, longing, fear, all playing out in real time. The cinematography traps us in that moment with her. The camera stays close, cutting between her reflection in the window and her trembling face. The passing city lights flicker over her skin, like memories flashing through her mind. The editing doesn't rush. It allows the rhythm of the train to become a heartbeat, echoing her inner turmoil. The lighting is soft and natural, yet the framing feels almost suffocating, creating a sense of intimacy that borders on discomfort. It's one of those scenes where the camera feels alive, breathing with a character, translating emotion directly into image. Framing and composition are used throughout the film to reflect emotional distance or intimacy. At home, Connie and Edward are often shown in wide shots, separated by physical objects, a table, a staircase, or simply empty space. This distance emphasizes the quiet gaps in their marriage. When they speak, the camera doesn't always bring them together in the same frame. Instead, it cuts between isolated close-ups, reinforcing that they are emotionally disconnected. In contrast, Connie's scenes with Paul are framed tightly, often in shallow focus. The world around them blurs away, leaving only their faces and hands. The lens compresses space, turning small gestures into monumental ones. A glance, a touch, a breath. The shallow depth of field becomes a visual metaphor for tunnel vision. When Connie is with Paul, she sees nothing and no one else. Lyne and Bijoux use mirrors and reflections extensively to symbolize duality and deception. Connie is frequently filmed near reflective surfaces, mirrors, glass, windows, creating a doubling effect. Sometimes the reflection dominates the frame, suggesting that she's watching herself from the outside, trapped between who she is and who she's becoming. Even mundane reflections, like her face seen in a shop window or a bathroom mirror, carry emotional weight. They're moments of reckoning, quiet reminders that she's living two lives. When Edward begins to suspect her, reflections and shadows also creep into his scenes, mirroring his growing awareness and fractured trust. Lighting continues to evolve as the film moves toward its darker chapters. Once Edward learns of the affair, the lighting around him becomes colder and more unforgiving. The soft glow of family life gives way to sharp contrasts and cooler tones. The camera begins to close in on him, tighter shots, fewer wide angles, turning his world smaller and more claustrophobic. Even daylight feels harsh now, as if the truth itself is burning through the film. This visual change mirrors his emotional descent. The world no longer looks safe or ordinary. Every corner of their home feels heavy with memory, and the cinematography captures that suffocation perfectly. During the film's most shocking moment, the confrontation between Edward and Paul, the cinematography delivers its most haunting work. The camera remains steady, almost clinical, refusing to sensationalize the violence. The tension comes not from movement or editing but from stillness. The lighting is soft but dim, creating an eerie calm that makes the act even more disturbing. The framing is close, intimate, offering no escape. It feels like the camera itself doesn't want to look but can't turn away. Afterwards, when Edward sits in silence, the lens holds on his face for what feels like an eternity, allowing the weight of his guilt to fill the frame. This restraint is what makes the moment unforgettable. The cinematography doesn't tell us what to feel. It forces us to feel it ourselves. As the film moves into its final act, the visuals settle into a tone of quiet aftermath. The warm tones of the affair have vanished, replaced by muted grays and colder blues. The world feels drained just as the characters do. Wide shots return, but they no longer suggest peace. They suggest emptiness. The home is the same, but the light is different, as if something vital has been permanently extinguished. Even the compositions that once symbolized family togetherness now feel hollow. Bijou uses these subtle visual cues to tell us that nothing can return to what it was, that the damage is permanent. Beyond its emotional symbolism, Unfaithful is filled with small visual moments that stay etched in memory. The editing and pacing in Unfaithful are the invisible architecture of its emotional power, the unseen rhythm that decides when the audience breathes, when they lean forward, and when they can't look away. Editor N.V. Coates, who had a long history of shaping emotionally complex films, treats Unfaithful less like a straightforward domestic thriller and more like a psychological symphony. The film's rhythm begins in harmony, soft and orderly, mirroring the calm structure of Connie and Edward's suburban life. Cuts are languid, transitions smooth, and scenes given space to unfold at a natural pace. You can feel the air of predictability in how long the camera lingers on daily rituals. The breakfast table, the school run, the polite exchanges between husband and wife. The editing makes these early passages feel like the repetition of a well-practiced dance, almost hypnotic in its domestic normalcy. But this calm isn't meant to last. It's the control before the chaos. When Paul enters the narrative, the film's pulse shifts. The pacing begins to stutter and accelerate, mirroring Connie's internal turbulence. Coates and Lyne start to introduce quicker cuts that mirror the thrill of secrecy and lust. Instead of full conversations, we start getting fragments. Glances, the brushing of hands, a quick doorway shot, edited together to evoke the sensation of a racing heart. Scenes no longer open and close neatly. They bleed into each other, overlapping sound and image to create a sense of disorientation. This editing rhythm communicates infidelity not through words, but through tempo. The film literally begins to move differently once temptation takes hold. One of the most masterful uses of pacing is how the film transitions between Connie's two worlds. The suburban home is edited with long, measured takes that suggest routine, obligation, and constraint. The city and Paul's loft, on the other hand, are cut more fluidly, with handheld intimacy and a slightly fractured rhythm that suggests spontaneity and danger. The switch between these two editing styles becomes its own kind of emotional shorthand. When Connie takes the train back to her home, the editing stitches her dual realities together. The rhythmic clatter of the train cuts against fleeting memories of passion, making time itself feel untrustworthy. That famous train sequence is a perfect demonstration of editorial tone. The motion of the carriage, the flash of passing lights, and the alternation between Connie's reflection and her expression all build to a near-physical experience of guilt and desire. Coates understands that pacing is not about speed but control. The editing intentionally slows down during moments of dread or moral reckoning. After the affair begins to weigh on Connie, the film starts stretching shots longer, holding her in frames just a bit too long to let discomfort bloom. The silence between edits becomes its own kind of dialogue, forcing the audience to sit with the character's unease. Even moments that could have been cut more briskly, like Edward's quiet discoveries or the family dinner scenes, are allowed to linger just enough to heighten dramatic irony. The audience knows what's hidden, and the edit forces them to live in that tension. When the story veers toward its darker turns, the editing grows more fragmented again, but this time not with the feverish rush of passion. It's the erratic rhythm of guilt and unraveling. Flashbacks and memory shots begin to feel less sensual and more haunted. The edit patterns mirror emotional collapse. Tighter framings, quicker cuts, less air between reactions. The confrontation scene, where Edward's knowledge collides with Connie's guilt, is deliberately held in long, excruciating takes. There's no rapid cutting to relieve the pressure. Instead, Coates and Lyne trust silence and sustained duration to generate intensity. The decision to use longer takes here isn't a stylistic flourish. It's psychological realism. When real-life crises hit, time stretches and perception sharpens. The editing mimics that distorted experience of time, making the audience feel the slow-motion horror of realization. Transitions also play an understated yet crucial role. The editors use sound bridges, like a snippet of conversation, a music cue, or ambient city noise, to blur boundaries between spaces and emotions. For instance, the soft hum of the suburban vacuum might crossfade into the murmur of city traffic, connecting two different worlds through rhythm alone. These small transitions make Connie's double life feel like one continuous, suffocating loop. Coates's use of match cuts, like hands reaching, doors opening, or mirrors reflecting, quietly reinforces parallels between deceit and routine. Perhaps the most brilliant aspect of the film's pacing is how it handles anticipation. Unfaithful doesn't rush to its pivotal event. The act of violence comes late, after an hour and a half of careful build-up. This patience is what gives the moment its devastating power. The long, simmering rhythm of the first two acts allows the eruption to feel volcanic rather than mechanical. Even after the climactic scene, the editing resists closure. It slows again, breathing through aftermath, guilt, and the quiet dread of living with consequences. The film ends not on a frenetic montage but on contemplative, deliberate pacing that reflects moral exhaustion. Overall, the editing in Unfaithful is less about keeping viewers entertained through movement and more about keeping them emotionally aligned with the character's psychological tempo. Every transition, every delay, every withheld cut builds intimacy between the viewer and Connie's experience. The rhythm of the film becomes a mirror of her desire, guilt, and eventual despair, seductive in its slowness, suffocating in its silences, and devastating in its restraint. It's the kind of editing that doesn't call attention to itself but shapes how the audience feels time, stretching it, compressing it, and finally trapping it in the quiet, unbearable pause between truth and concealment. The soundtrack and score in Unfaithful are among the most quietly powerful elements of the entire film. They don't just accompany the emotions on screen. They guide them, shaping the viewer's inner rhythm and making the unspoken feel tangible. Composer Jan P. Kaczmarek crafts a musical landscape that feels like it's breathing in sync with the character's psychological states. Rather than leaning on grand romantic cues or overtly dramatic orchestrations, Kaczmarek builds the score from restraint. Gentle piano motifs, muted strings, and slowly evolving harmonies that evoke longing, secrecy, and emotional disarray. This is not music that tells you what to feel. It lets you drift into the film's emotional current until you're living in its silences and sighs. The opening sequences are intentionally understated, introducing the film's sonic tone with delicate, almost transparent instrumentation. Soft piano lines and distant, reverb-laden strings create an aura of calm domesticity, subtly touched by melancholy. It's music that feels safe but slightly faded, as though something has already begun to erode beneath the surface. This early restraint mirrors the routine of Connie and Edward's suburban life. Tidy, measured, and emotionally tempered. The pacing of the score matches the visual rhythm. Long notes stretch across scenes like lingering thoughts, suggesting that beneath the facade of peace, there's a quiet ache waiting to be disturbed. When Paul appears, the entire sound palette begins to shift. The strings deepen, and the piano motifs become more fragmented, reflecting Connie's destabilizing emotions. In scenes of temptation and secrecy, Kaczmarek introduces subtle rhythmic pulses, barely perceptible patterns that mimic the sensation of a quickened heartbeat. The affair sequences use slightly warmer, more tactile textures. Soft cellos, slow arpeggiated piano figures, and breathy synthesizer layers that seem to hover in the background like the echo of a memory. This shift in instrumentation marks the emotional divide between Connie's two lives, the sterile safety of home versus the sensual unpredictability of the city. It's not just a tonal contrast, it's psychological storytelling through sound. The brilliance of the score lies in its use of recurring motifs. A few haunting melodic fragments, simple, unresolved phrases, reappear throughout the film at key emotional junctures. They don't announce themselves. They slip in quietly, as if carried by Connie's thoughts. You might hear the same sequence of notes behind a moment of passion, then later behind a moment of guilt, the meaning transformed by context. These motifs function like emotional ghosts, binding the film together in a subconscious loop. They remind us that desire and remorse, love and betrayal, are inseparable in this story. Equally important is the film's mastery of silence. Lyne and Kaczmarek understand that what you don't hear can be as powerful as what you do. In several crucial moments, Connie alone on the train, Edward piecing together clues, or the final car sequence, the music recedes completely, leaving only the hum of ambient sound, the rattle of the tracks, the thrum of rain, the rustle of clothing. This diegetic silence amplifies tension and intimacy. It draws the viewer closer, forcing them to listen to the texture of the world and, by extension, to the emotional noise within the characters. The absence of music in these scenes becomes its own kind of score, raw, unnerving, and hyper-real. The sound design supports this delicate balance. Everyday sounds, footsteps, wind, a turning key, are recorded with heightened sensitivity, so even the smallest noises carry emotional weight. When Connie meets Paul, there's an almost imperceptible shift in the mix. Ambient city sounds grow fuller, the hum of life becomes more pronounced, and the environment feels more alive. Back at home, sound becomes cleaner and more muffled, the suburban quiet underscoring her growing sense of suffocation. These sonic contrasts subtly track her psychological distance from her family, even when nothing is explicitly said. One of the most memorable uses of music occurs during the train sequence, perhaps the emotional centerpiece of the film. Here, Kaczmarek's score weaves a fine thread between guilt and desire. A soft, cyclical piano figure repeats like the rhythm of the wheels beneath the tracks. Strings whisper in and out, not swelling dramatically but trembling at the edges, as if barely holding composure. The effect is haunting. It's as though the music is echoing Connie's internal conflict, her mind replaying fragments of passion while her body sits frozen in shame. This blend of movement and stillness gives the sequence its hypnotic, almost dreamlike quality. As the film darkens, the score follows suit, growing sparse and colder. The later scenes abandon warmth entirely. The music doesn't dramatize the violence or the revelation. It retreats, letting the silence carry the moral weight. When sound finally returns, it's distant and fractured, built from dissonant string chords and unresolved intervals. The harmony never settles into a resolution, mirroring the character's inability to return to peace. Kaczmarek's refusal to resolve the music becomes a moral choice. In this world, no note, no feeling, and no relationship can end neatly. Even the film's end credits carry this emotional tension. Instead of swelling triumphantly or offering closure, the final cue feels suspended. A soft echo of earlier motifs played slower, more faded, as if the music itself has grown tired from carrying so much unspoken pain. The viewer leaves the film not with a sense of catharsis but with an ache, a kind of quiet dissonance that lingers long after the screen fades. The genius of Unfaithful's soundtrack and score lies in their emotional invisibility. The music never overpowers, never insists. It simply inhabits the same emotional oxygen as the characters. Kaczmarek and Lyne understand that desire, guilt, and heartbreak live not in grand symphonies but in fragile, trembling silences and half-remembered melodies. Every note and every pause is calibrated to pull the viewer deeper into the psychological storm beneath the film's calm surface. By the end, you don't remember individual pieces of music. You remember how it felt to hear them, how the score made stillness feel dangerous, and how silence made emotion deafening. Unfaithful is a film that thrives on the gray areas of morality, exploring the tangled web between desire, guilt, and the human craving for something beyond the predictable. It's not just about adultery. It's about the quiet ache beneath the surface of everyday life, the kind of yearning that grows when everything seems perfect on paper but feels empty in the heart. The film asks an uncomfortably honest question. What happens when fulfillment becomes routine, when stability turns into stillness, and when the safety of love begins to feel like a cage? Connie's affair is not merely an act of betrayal. It's a symptom of emotional starvation. She has a good husband, a lovely home, and a comfortable life. But all of that becomes background noise against the sound of her own pulse, suddenly awakened by the thrill of forbidden intimacy. One of the most striking themes in Unfaithful is the fragility of human contentment. The film suggests that happiness is not a permanent state, but a delicate balance that can be shattered by a single unexpected desire. Connie's life is stable but stagnant. She's surrounded by comfort but starved of intensity. The film portrays infidelity not as evil, but as a desperate act of aliveness, an escape from the dull rhythm of predictability. This complexity is what makes the story so compelling. Connie's choices are wrong but deeply human. The audience is forced to confront their own moral elasticity, to question whether passion can ever be truly justified when it threatens to destroy everything else. The film also delves into the moral consequences of truth and lies, showing how deception becomes a kind of slow poison. Each time Connie hides her affair, she's not just lying to Edward, she's slowly rewriting her identity. The affair transforms her, not just emotionally but existentially. It forces her to confront who she is versus who she pretends to be. In contrast, Edward's discovery of the affair unravels the quiet stability he's built his world on. His moral collapse is as raw and devastating as Connie's emotional one. Through this duality, Unfaithful paints a haunting picture of how truth and secrecy coexist in every relationship. It's not about whether people lie, it's about how long they can live with the weight of it. Another powerful layer of Unfaithful lies in its exploration of gender and emotional invisibility. Connie's journey is an unflinching look at female desire. Messy, unapologetic, and often silenced. Society tends to grant men the freedom to explore passion, while expecting women to remain the emotional anchors of the household. But Unfaithful challenges that double standard. It gives space to a woman's longing, not to romanticize it, but to expose the loneliness it conceals. Connie's affair becomes both rebellion and self-destruction, a cry for validation in a world that sees her as a mother and wife before a person. Adrian Lyne's storytelling dares to humanize her choices without condoning them, inviting empathy where judgment usually resides. Beneath the sensuality and scandal, the film also grapples with the nature of consequence. The affair isn't glamorous. It's messy, fearful, and ultimately tragic. Every passionate encounter carries the shadow of destruction, and when the inevitable collapse comes, it's brutal in its emotional realism. Edward's violent reaction is not framed as villainous, but as the ultimate manifestation of love turned feral. His rage is born not from cruelty but from heartbreak, the unbearable realization that devotion can coexist with deceit. In this sense, Unfaithful becomes a portrait of love's darker twin. Obsession, the kind that blurs the line between affection and possession. Lyne also weaves in the theme of fate versus choice. The entire story unfolds as a series of chance moments, an encounter with a stranger on a windy street, a book that falls from someone's hands, a moment of hesitation that turns into surrender. These small, seemingly innocent details set in motion an avalanche of consequences. The film subtly argues that tragedy is rarely born from one grand decision. It's a build-up of small ones, each rationalized in the moment, each eroding the moral foundation just a little more. This cumulative effect mirrors real human behavior, the way we justify impulses until they rewrite our lives. The film's use of mirrors and reflections deepens its thematic impact. Every mirrored surface becomes symbolic of duality. Connie's two selves, the devoted wife and the impulsive lover, staring back at each other. These reflections remind the audience that everyone harbors contradictions, and that morality isn't a clear line but a spectrum shaped by emotion, fear, and circumstance. The story's tension arises from that very recognition, that anyone, under the right or wrong conditions, might cross the line they once swore they never would. Silence also becomes a theme in itself. The moments between Connie and Edward after the truth begins to surface are steeped in unbearable quiet, the kind of silence that weighs more than words ever could. It's in that stillness that the film asks its most haunting question. Can love survive the knowledge of betrayal? And if it can, what form does it take afterward? Forgiveness here isn't painted as noble, but as something fragile, tentative, and unfinished. The couple's final moments in the car are a masterclass in ambiguity. They don't resolve anything, but they reveal everything about human complexity. They sit between confession and denial, between love and loss, between the past they can't erase and the future they're too afraid to face. Beyond the story of passion and guilt, Unfaithful serves as a philosophical meditation on the nature of human desire itself. It argues that desire is not something that can be controlled. It's elemental, unpredictable, and often self-destructive. But it also insists that to desire is to be alive, and that this aliveness, however dangerous, is what makes us human. The tragedy of Connie and Edward lies not just in the affair, but in their shared realization that love is not immune to weakness. In that recognition lies the film's ultimate message, that being human means living with contradiction, carrying both guilt and grace, and knowing that even the most loving hearts are capable of harm. By the time the film ends, Unfaithful has stripped away the glamour of infidelity and the simplicity of moral judgment, leaving behind a portrait of two people standing in the ruins of what they once believed was unbreakable. The themes linger not because they offer answers, but because they reflect truth, the kind of truth that people rarely speak aloud. It's about what happens when love meets imperfection, when desire turns to chaos, and when the pursuit of feeling alive collides with the cost of being human. It's unsettling, thought-provoking, and painfully real, because at its core, Unfaithful is not about what's right or wrong. It's about what it means to feel. In Unfaithful, 2002, the visual effects and CGI are so understated that most viewers wouldn't even realize how much careful manipulation is happening behind the camera. This isn't a film about monsters, explosions, or digital spectacle. It's a story grounded in realism, intimacy, and emotional chaos. Yet, that doesn't mean the technical side of the production is simple. In fact, the film's subtle use of visual effects and digital enhancements plays a huge role in maintaining the illusion of authenticity, allowing the audience to sink completely into the emotional storm of the characters without ever being reminded that they're watching a constructed world. Every reflection, shadow, and flicker of light feels purposeful, and that illusion is the result of meticulous planning that blends practical artistry with invisible post-production finesse. What's fascinating about Unfaithful is that its most effective visual effects come from restraint. The director, Adrian Lyne, has always been known for his meticulous eye for detail, and here, the effects are designed not to dazzle but to disappear. Many of the scenes that seem entirely natural, like the rainy streets of New York, the sunlight filtering through the suburban windows, or the moody amber glow of Paul's loft, are in fact partially digitally altered. Rain is often simulated or enhanced in post-production, reflections are digitally softened, and subtle lens flares or light diffusion are added to heighten emotional resonance. The result is a world that looks utterly real but feels emotionally heightened, a reflection of Connie's inner state. The calm exteriors and the warm lighting of her home mirror her attempts at control, while the dim, smoky textures of Paul's world pulse with tension and desire, achieved through a careful interplay between practical lighting and digital color grading. In a way, the visual effects here operate like an emotional translator. Every slight digital adjustment carries meaning. When Connie meets Paul for the first time, the city seems to shimmer ever so slightly. Reflections gleam off wet pavements, the wind lifts her hair in slow motion, and the world around them momentarily loses its harsh edges. There's no overt CGI trickery, but the digital cleanup, grading, and compositing give the scene a dreamlike fluidity, blurring the line between fantasy and reality. As her affair deepens, this manipulation becomes more pronounced. Lighting subtly changes tone, skin textures are smoothed, shadows deepen, and backgrounds are softened, mirroring the disorienting intoxication of infatuation. It's an invisible use of technology to convey emotion, far more powerful than any obvious digital spectacle. Practical effects also play a crucial role in creating tactile authenticity. When the story turns dark and violent, everything suddenly feels heavier and more grounded. The infamous confrontation scene isn't built through CGI blood or artificial shock but through precision. Practical makeup, breakaway props, and clever camera angles are used to achieve the sudden, shocking realism of that moment. If any digital effects are involved, they're only there to clean up imperfections, to hide wires, smooth transitions, or subtly adjust lighting continuity. The production design and on-set practical craftsmanship do most of the heavy lifting, while the digital team enhances the details invisibly. Even scenes that seem visually simple, like Connie's train rides or her quiet moments in the shower, are layered with subtle visual manipulation. The motion blur of passing scenery, the condensation on glass, the reflections in mirrors, and the soft fall-off of light across her face. All are meticulously crafted and often digitally refined to maintain emotional coherence. The train window reflections, for example, serve as visual metaphors for duality. Her two lives coexisting, overlapping, and threatening to collapse into one. Digital compositing and post-production color correction ensure that every shot feels psychologically aligned with her shifting inner world. One of the most interesting aspects of Unfaithful's visual construction is its relationship between practical and digital artistry. Adrian Lyne's background in commercials and stylized erotic thrillers like Fatal Attraction and 9.5 Weeks shows in his obsession with light, texture, and reflection. But while his earlier work relied heavily on overt visual stylization, Unfaithful tones it down into something more naturalistic. Still, achieving that kind of invisible style requires tremendous technical precision. Every lamp, curtain, and reflective surface is part of the film's emotional palette. Many scenes are color-balanced and digitally retouched in post-production to maintain consistent tone and mood. The film's warm golden hues, contrasted against the gray urban scenes, weren't just a product of on-set lighting. They were carefully finessed through color timing and digital enhancement to evoke nostalgia, comfort, and the illusion of stability. When Connie visits Paul's apartment, the environment shifts completely. The lighting turns more natural, almost raw, and the color palette desaturates just slightly, hinting at danger beneath seduction. Visual effects come into play here in very subtle ways. Shadows are deepened, motion blur is enhanced, and reflections are softened or erased to focus our attention entirely on the intimacy of touch and breath. Even the use of steam, dust, and background haze is carefully layered in post-production, giving these sequences a tactile sensuality that mirrors Connie's awakening desire. Nothing feels digital, yet every detail has been digitally perfected to serve emotion over spectacle. It's also worth noting that the few overt digital effects in Unfaithful are primarily used for environmental realism. For example, the use of digital rain, sky extensions, and atmospheric grading helps create continuity between shots filmed in different locations or lighting conditions. These enhancements maintain immersion. Viewers never notice the transitions because they're designed to feel completely organic. Even reflections in car windows and mirrors, notoriously difficult to control on set, are often digitally adjusted to remove crew visibility or unwanted glare, maintaining the illusion of a self-contained world. The final act of the film uses its most powerful visual manipulation in the smallest ways. The aftermath of the central tragedy unfolds under muted lighting and subdued color, achieved not by drastically changing the photography but by digitally pulling warmth from the image, leaving a faint coolness that matches the emotional coldness of guilt. The house no longer glows. It looks hollow. The world feels drained. These choices are quiet but potent, the kind of invisible artistry that most viewers feel rather than see. Ultimately, the visual effects and CGI in Unfaithful operate as emotional architecture rather than spectacle. They're there to serve the film's realism, to build an atmosphere that feels lived-in, sensual, and suffocating all at once. Nothing feels fake, yet almost everything has been touched by digital precision, whether it's a softened shadow, a composited reflection, or a subtly color-shifted hue. The craftsmanship lies in invisibility. The audience never thinks about the technical construction because the emotion feels so natural. The set design and locations in Unfaithful, 2002, are crafted with such precision and emotional intelligence that they function almost as silent characters within the story. Every wall, window, and piece of furniture seems to hold its own secret, mirroring the lives of Connie and Edward Sullivan as they unravel beneath the surface of domestic perfection. Production designer Brian Morris and director Adrian Lyne create a world that feels utterly believable yet symbolically rich, where every location is loaded with emotional subtext. Instead of being mere backdrops, these spaces shape the tone, mood, and even the morality of the story. The environments become reflections of desire, guilt, and the fragile boundaries between passion and destruction. The Sullivan home is the first and most dominant space we encounter, and it immediately conveys everything we need to know about Connie's life before her affair. It's the quintessential image of suburban comfort, large but not ostentatious, elegant but restrained. The home is filled with warm wood tones, soft fabrics, and gentle natural lighting that filters in through wide windows. The design radiates safety and order. Everything is perfectly placed, from the framed family photographs on the mantel to the clean, symmetrical arrangement of the living room furniture. The kitchen, with its gleaming countertops and cozy breakfast nook, looks like the heart of a stable family life. Yet, beneath this perfection lies emotional stagnation. The very neatness of the space begins to feel like a cage, every polished surface reflecting a life that has become too smooth, too predictable, too sanitized. Adrian Lyne, known for his fascination with the domestic spaces that hide private chaos, Fatal Attraction, 9.5 Weeks, uses the Sullivan home as a visual metaphor for repression. The clean lines, the beige and honey tones, the tidy rooms, all symbolize emotional control, the suppression of impulses. Even the architecture of the house reinforces Connie's entrapment. Narrow hallways, closed-off rooms, and staircases that seem to lead nowhere new. As the film progresses and Connie's guilt grows, the house seems to close in on her. The lighting subtly shifts. Warmer tones give way to cooler hues, shadows become longer, and the once inviting rooms begin to feel airless. The more she hides her affair, the more the house transforms from sanctuary to prison. One of the most striking aspects of the home's design is how it interacts with the cinematography. Windows and mirrors are used throughout the film as visual symbols of duplicity and reflection. Connie is often seen framed in mirrors or behind glass, visually split in two, a reminder of her double life. The transparency of the house's design, with its large open spaces and glass doors, ironically amplifies her secrecy. It's a house meant for light and openness, yet it's filled with hidden truths. The effect is hauntingly subtle. The set design creates a psychological tension without a single word spoken. Then there's Paul's apartment, a complete inversion of everything the Sullivan home represents. Located in Soho, it's a world away from suburban stillness, and it visually pulses with sensuality and unpredictability. The apartment is drenched in texture, exposed brick walls, wooden beams, and scattered art supplies. It's cluttered, messy, and alive. The lighting is dim and moody, filtered through blinds and curtains that create slashes of shadow across the room. There's an unpolished intimacy to the space. It feels like a place where emotions are lived rather than hidden. The production design emphasizes imperfection. Books stacked haphazardly, clothes draped casually, uneven lighting, and that imperfection becomes intoxicating. Paul's apartment functions as both a physical and psychological escape for Connie. The design evokes freedom and danger all at once. Every object feels like it has a story. The antique furniture, the cluttered desk, the half-finished artwork. The apartment's atmosphere blurs the line between art and chaos, reflecting Paul's own seductive unpredictability. It's the visual opposite of Connie's home. Where the house is about control, this apartment is about surrender. The set design intentionally emphasizes that contrast. Even the color palette shifts dramatically. Warm suburban golds give way to urban grays, burgundies, and deep browns, colors that suggest passion, secrecy, and decay. The textures, wood, brick, fabric, create a tactile intimacy that mirrors the physicality of the affair itself. Every time Connie steps into Paul's world, the film's visual tone changes. The camera moves closer, the lighting softens, and the spaces feel more enclosed, more personal. The design of his apartment encourages touch. It's a place built for physical connection, not emotional conversation. The tight corners and low ceilings create a sense of claustrophobic intimacy, intensifying every look, every gesture. It's as though the space itself conspires to make the affair happen. Beyond these two primary locations, the film's use of transitional spaces is equally rich in meaning. The streets of New York City, where Connie first meets Paul, are captured with a kind of restless realism. The wind, the uneven pavement, the crowded sidewalks, all serve as sensory contrasts to the calm suburb she comes from. The antique bookshop where they meet is designed to feel timeless and mysterious. Dusty shelves, dim lighting, and the soft creak of wooden floors. It's a space filled with old stories, foreshadowing the one Connie is about to create for herself. The randomness of this setting adds to the film's theme of fate. It feels like a place where lives cross by accident, but consequences are inevitable. The train, which carries Connie between the city and her home, is perhaps the film's most poetic location. Its design is simple, but its meaning is profound. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the reflections in the glass, the fleeting glimpses of landscape, all become visual representations of her internal conflict. The train is the physical manifestation of her double life, constantly moving between two worlds that cannot coexist. The reflections on the train window often show her face against the blurred backdrop of passing scenery, symbolizing her fractured identity. The set design of the train car emphasizes isolation even in motion. She's surrounded by people, yet entirely alone in her thoughts. Props are another subtle but powerful part of Unfaithful's design language. The book Connie buys from Paul, the scarf that slips from her shoulders, the framed family photographs, all become loaded with symbolism. The scarf, for example, is not just an accessory. It's an object that reappears, linking her two worlds, representing temptation and exposure. The family photographs are strategically placed throughout the house as reminders of what she's risking. As the story unfolds, even these everyday objects begin to feel heavy with meaning, their innocent presence tainted by her secret. The shift in the set design during the film's final act is especially powerful. After Edward discovers the truth, the house transforms again. The lighting becomes colder, the shadows deeper, the symmetry now unsettling. The same rooms that once looked warm now feel sterile and haunted. The dialogue and script of Unfaithful, 2002, form the emotional backbone of the film, sculpting an atmosphere where every word, pause, and silence vibrates with tension. This isn't a film that thrives on witty one-liners or grand monologues. It's one that uses the texture of everyday speech to explore extraordinary emotional territory. Alvin Sargent and William Broyles Jr.'s screenplay transforms the ordinary language of love, guilt, and routine into something cinematic and deeply psychological. What's remarkable is that the dialogue never feels like movie talk. It's natural, fragmented, hesitant, the way real people speak when they're holding back feelings they can't articulate. In Unfaithful, the most powerful moments don't come from what's said, but from what's carefully avoided. The first act establishes this beautifully. The conversations between Connie and Edward at home feel so authentic that they could be taken from any long-term marriage. They talk about household errands, their child's school, the weather, banal details that speak volumes about the comfort and staleness of their relationship. The rhythm of their dialogue is familiar, predictable, safe. But beneath that safety is a quiet ache, a longing for something beyond predictability. The script uses these seemingly mundane exchanges as a form of emotional camouflage. The normalcy of their speech hides the emptiness of their connection. What's fascinating is how much absence defines the dialogue. What's missing from their words becomes as telling as what's included. Connie doesn't express dissatisfaction outright, but you can feel it in the tone, in the way she lets conversations trail off, in the moments when silence lingers a beat too long. Then comes the spark. The dialogue between Connie and Paul. Their first meeting in the Soho bookshop is written with deliberate contrast. Suddenly, the rhythm of conversation changes. It's flirtatious but never forced, confident but not pushy. Paul's words are smooth, tinged with foreign allure and literary charm, but they aren't over the top. He doesn't use grand language. He uses quiet boldness. His famous line, "You don't have to be careful," lands not because it's poetic, but because it's dangerously honest. It's the kind of line that sounds casual on the surface but carries layers of subtext. It invites risk, rebellion, desire. The screenwriters understood that seduction is not about what's said directly. It's about how tone and subtext seduce the listener's imagination. The dialogue between Connie and Paul grows more intimate as their affair intensifies, but it never tips into melodrama. Their exchanges are short, breathy, interrupted, like the rhythm of their encounters. When they talk, they're not just trading words. They're discovering pieces of themselves they've buried. Paul's dialogue is written to pull Connie out of her suburban shell, while hers becomes increasingly fragmented, reflecting the emotional chaos she's descending into. There's a scene where she tries to rationalize what's happening. "I can't do this," she says. Paul replies, "Then don't." 2 words, and yet they reveal everything. The push and pull between temptation and guilt is distilled into a few syllables. The simplicity of that exchange shows how the script uses minimalism to maximum emotional effect. The brilliance of the writing lies in how it makes small talk feel dangerous. When Connie returns home after seeing Paul, her conversations with Edward take on a new subtext. The same domestic exchanges that once felt ordinary now feel like lies. Every casual "How was your day?" becomes a test. The dialogue becomes a chess game of concealment, each character speaking normally while trying to hide an inner storm. The tension is amplified not through shouting or arguments but through restraint. The more Connie lies, the quieter she gets. The quieter she gets, the more suspicious Edward becomes. This slow erosion of honesty is mapped perfectly through dialogue that loses its warmth and rhythm as guilt takes hold. Edward's lines are some of the most understated yet heartbreaking in the film. Richard Gere delivers them with quiet devastation, and the writing gives him just enough to convey oceans of pain. When he asks Connie, "Did you love him?" it's not written as an accusation but as a plea. That single question encapsulates the entire emotional devastation of betrayal. The fact that the script gives her a small, almost whispered no as a reply is perfect. It doesn't close the wound, it deepens it. These are not words exchanged between people seeking closure. They're fragments of 2 lives shattering quietly. The script also excels in the way it uses dialogue to expose character psychology. Connie's language evolves throughout the film. In the beginning, she's polite, structured, articulate, the model wife. As the affair consumes her, her speech patterns change. She hesitates more, interrupts herself, repeats phrases, and loses her fluency. It's as if the more passion she experiences, the less control she has over her words. Her dialogue becomes an emotional barometer. By contrast, Paul's dialogue remains smooth and composed throughout, highlighting the imbalance in their relationship. He never loses linguistic control. He manipulates through calmness, while Connie unravels through hesitation. One of the screenplay's great strengths is its use of silence as dialogue. The writers and Adrian Lyne both understood that in moments of heightened emotion, words often fail. The scenes between Connie and Edward after the affair is discovered are filled with long, unbearable silences that say everything words can't. The pauses, the looks, the sounds of breathing, these are the film's true dialogue. The script doesn't force its characters to explain their feelings. It lets silence do the talking. This restraint is rare in Hollywood dramas, which often rely on explicit confrontation. Here, silence becomes the loudest expression of pain. Even the everyday dialogue has depth. The lines between Connie and her friends or between Edward and his co-workers aren't filler. They're mirrors of their inner states. When Connie tries to act normal at lunch with her friends, her nervous chatter and distracted responses subtly reveal how far she's drifted from her old life. The writing gives her the illusion of normalcy, but every misplaced laugh and half-hearted answer exposes her turmoil. Similarly, Edward's conversations at work, measured, professional, routine, become haunting in their normality once we know what's happening at home. The dialogue's brilliance lies in its contrast between surface calm and buried chaos. The script also refuses to make its characters eloquent in their suffering. When Edward confronts Paul, the scene doesn't rely on clever words. The dialogue is sparse, polite even. "You're better off without her," Edward says, and the quiet civility of that line makes what follows so much more shocking. It's not a verbal outburst that triggers the violence. It's the lack of one. The film understands that real rage often hides behind calm, and the writing mirrors that emotional truth. There are also subtle, poetic touches scattered throughout the screenplay. When Connie confesses her affair, she describes it by saying, "It's not that I didn't love my husband. I did. I was walking along and the wind blew me." That line encapsulates the film's entire philosophy about infidelity, not as a moral failure, but as something accidental, elemental, beyond control. Unfaithful, 2002, occupies a fascinating place within the genre of erotic thrillers, a space that was once crowded with pulpy, high-gloss stories about desire, danger, and moral downfall. But what makes Unfaithful stand apart is how it takes that genre and quietly reshapes it into something more emotionally complex and psychologically authentic. Where most films of its kind lean into sensationalism, fast pacing, exaggerated confrontations, stylized eroticism, Adrian Lyne's film turns inward, focusing less on the act of betrayal and more on its ripple effects. Instead of treating infidelity as a plot device, it treats it as an existential crisis. It's both an erotic thriller and a deeply human domestic drama, walking a tightrope between genre expectations and raw emotional realism. The film opens with all the hallmarks of a traditional domestic melodrama: a stable suburban family, a loving marriage, a beautiful home filled with routine and predictability. This setup is classic, almost too perfect, inviting the audience to expect that something will soon rupture it. In most thrillers, that rupture would come through external danger, a stalker, a blackmailer, or a conspiracy. But here, the disruption comes from something far smaller and infinitely more personal: a gust of wind on a New York street, a chance encounter in a used bookstore, a single moment of temptation. Lyne takes the genre's typical framework of temptation and danger, but replaces melodrama with microrealism. The suspense comes not from what might happen, but from what's already happening internally. Traditionally, erotic thrillers exaggerate both seduction and danger, making affairs look glamorous, mysterious, and thrilling. Unfaithful resists that gloss. The eroticism here isn't built on fantasy, but on awkwardness, impulsivity, and guilt. When Connie meets Paul, their attraction isn't cinematic perfection. It's messy, human, clumsy, and real. The first time she goes to his apartment, she's nervous, hesitant, laughing out of discomfort rather than confidence. This isn't the stylized cat-and-mouse seduction of Fatal Attraction or Body Heat. It's something that feels dangerously plausible. The film subverts the genre by stripping it of its typical voyeuristic sheen and grounding it in emotional truth. Desire isn't presented as a game here. It's presented as a collision between longing and consequence. The suspense in Unfaithful also operates differently than in most thrillers. Instead of building tension through external threats, like a detective chasing clues or a villain plotting revenge, Lyne builds it through emotional claustrophobia. The camera lingers on small, everyday moments that become unbearable under the weight of guilt. A phone ringing, a husband's glance, a spot of mud on a dress. These ordinary details become sources of dread. The genre's traditional adrenaline rush is replaced by a slow, suffocating sense of inevitability. Every domestic scene feels like a ticking time bomb. Every silence feels loaded with accusation. It's suspense by intimacy rather than spectacle. Even the film's violence, when it comes, is treated differently from what the genre usually delivers. In most erotic thrillers, violence is choreographed and heightened, meant to shock or thrill. In Unfaithful, it's quiet, almost accidental. The confrontation between Edward and Paul isn't driven by rage but by emotional exhaustion. The moment feels shocking precisely because it lacks the usual build-up or stylization. Lyne directs it with restraint, allowing the horror to come from recognition that a man who has been so measured, so rational, so gentle could cross an irreversible line. This shift from genre convention to psychological realism gives the violence far more weight. It isn't cathartic, it's tragic. Another way Unfaithful subverts its genre is by denying the audience the satisfaction of clear moral alignment. In most thrillers, there's a clear victim and a clear perpetrator, a line between good and bad. But here, the film refuses to let us sit comfortably on either side. Connie is neither villain nor victim. Edward is neither hero nor fool. Both are deeply flawed and deeply human. The script refuses to moralize or punish in the way traditional thrillers often do. Instead, it turns the question back on the viewer. Would you have done differently? This moral ambiguity, rare in mainstream thrillers, gives the film its enduring power. It becomes less about crime and punishment and more about empathy and consequence. Even the erotic elements, the lifeblood of the genre, are treated with nuance. Lyne doesn't present sex as spectacle but as storytelling. Each intimate scene serves a psychological purpose, charting Connie's transformation from guilt-ridden to reckless, from exhilarated to terrified. The scenes between her and Paul are choreographed not for titillation but for emotional mapping. The trembling hands, the awkward laughter, the heavy breathing, they convey everything about her inner turmoil. Where most films would use sex to escalate plot, Unfaithful uses it to reveal character. In terms of tone, Unfaithful also walks an unusual line between thriller and tragedy. There are no jump scares, no sudden twists, no manipulation of the audience's emotions through editing tricks. Instead, the film relies on dread, the kind that creeps up slowly, scene by scene. Lyne understands that real suspense doesn't come from surprise but from inevitability. We know the affair will be discovered, we just don't know how or when. And that inevitability makes every moment heavier. This subtle pacing, far from the breakneck energy of most genre films, invites the audience to marinate in discomfort. The tension is emotional, not procedural. The film's structure also plays with genre form. It begins like a romance, transforms into an erotic drama, then slides into a thriller, and finally settles into psychological tragedy. This fluidity is rare. Most films pick a lane. Lyne blends them so seamlessly that the audience doesn't notice the transition until they're in too deep. The editing rhythm follows the emotional arc rather than the genre template. The first half pulses with discovery and adrenaline, the middle with anxiety and deceit, the final act with quiet dread. By the end, the film has transformed from an affair narrative into a meditation on guilt, consequence, and love under pressure. Even the setting plays into genre subversion. Instead of sleek urban backdrops filled with neon and danger, Unfaithful takes place in soft, sunlit suburbia. The familiar landscapes of family life, school runs, kitchens, backyards, become the backdrop for betrayal. This choice redefines where danger lives. The real threat isn't lurking in the dark city streets. It's inside the quiet, picture-perfect home. By turning domestic spaces into psychological battlegrounds, the film gives the erotic thriller a new layer of depth. There's also something refreshing about the way Unfaithful handles gender dynamics within its genre. Many erotic thrillers of the 80s and 90s portrayed women as either victims or manipulative seductresses. Connie doesn't fit either archetype. The script and Lyne's direction treat her as a full person, someone capable of love, shame, desire, and moral failure. The film doesn't punish her for her sexuality, nor does it glorify it. It simply observes her humanity. This makes Unfaithful both a continuation and a quiet critique of its genre's history. Unfaithful, 2002, may seem at first glance like a straightforward erotic thriller about infidelity and consequence, but beneath its sensual tension and domestic unease, the film operates as a quiet piece of social and cultural commentary. It's a reflection of early 2000s suburban America, where material comfort masks emotional emptiness, and where the ideals of love, loyalty, and family coexist uneasily with restlessness, temptation, and dissatisfaction. Adrian Lyne doesn't just tell a story about adultery. He paints a portrait of a culture that's both obsessed with stability and perpetually hungry for more. The film's opening sequences establish a visual and emotional metaphor for this duality. Connie and Edward's life is built on order. A perfect house in Westchester, a loving child, the kind of domestic predictability that television commercials once held up as the American dream. But within that perfection lies suffocation. The home is spotless but sterile, the marriage affectionate but dulled by repetition. The suburban landscape, with its manicured lawns and endless calm, becomes a symbol of both achievement and confinement. Connie's affair with Paul, a man living in a chaotic Soho loft surrounded by books, art, and unpredictability, isn't just about lust. It's about rebellion against the numbing comfort of modern domestic life. This contrast between suburban safety and urban sensuality is one of the film's most telling cultural commentaries. The suburbs represent the triumph of middle-class ideals, control, family, respectability, while the city embodies everything those ideals suppress: freedom, chaos, instinct. Connie's movement between these two worlds mirrors a cultural struggle of its time, the tension between duty and desire, between maintaining appearances and pursuing authenticity. Lyne uses geography as psychology, turning every train ride between Westchester and Manhattan into a symbolic act of transgression. Unfaithful also explores gender expectations in a subtle yet piercing way. At its core, the film questions what society expects of women, especially wives and mothers, in the name of morality and stability. Connie's transgression isn't just personal. It's cultural. She steps outside the invisible boundaries that define what a good woman should be. In most films of its genre, the unfaithful woman is punished or vilified, but Lyne refuses to reduce her to a stereotype. Instead, he shows her complexity. She's not driven by cruelty or boredom but by longing, curiosity, and confusion. Her affair exposes not only her vulnerabilities but also the societal pressures that have confined her. The film becomes an unspoken critique of the emotional labor expected from women. How they're often asked to be the glue holding together the household, even when they themselves are quietly breaking. Edward's arc, too, serves as commentary on masculinity and pride. His reaction to Connie's affair reflects the cultural conditioning of men to equate betrayal with humiliation rather than heartbreak. The pain he feels isn't only emotional, it's existential, rooted in the loss of control, in the shattering of an image. The film subtly critiques how men are socialized to suppress vulnerability until it manifests as violence. When Edward finally breaks, it isn't premeditated vengeance. It's a desperate reclaiming of power in a world that has stripped him of certainty. Lyne doesn't glorify this breakdown. He frames it as tragic, exposing how societal definitions of masculinity can deform love into something self-destructive. On another level, Unfaithful engages with consumerist culture and the illusion of fulfillment. The Carsons live in a world that has achieved everything material success can offer: a beautiful home, financial comfort, family security, and yet they're haunted by a quiet void. The film uses this emptiness to critique the idea that success and happiness are interchangeable. Connie's affair isn't just about desire. It's about disconnection. Her home is filled with possessions but devoid of spontaneity. Paul's world, though materially sparse, pulses with energy and unpredictability. By juxtaposing these two environments, Lyne raises a subtle question. Has modern comfort made us too safe to feel alive? The film's treatment of sexuality itself is a commentary on cultural double standards. American cinema has long portrayed male infidelity as a flaw to be understood, but female infidelity as a moral crime. Unfaithful challenges that bias by humanizing Connie's desires instead of sensationalizing them. Her affair is portrayed not as an act of corruption, but as an awakening, tragic, flawed, but deeply human. The film suggests that women's desires are just as complex and valid as men's, even when they lead to chaos. In doing so, it confronts a cultural taboo that still lingers in discussions about female autonomy and sexuality. The class contrast between Connie and Paul also carries socio-cultural weight. Paul, the bohemian drifter living in a messy loft, represents a freedom that Connie's wealth has insulated her from. Their relationship blurs the lines between fantasy and rebellion, but it also exposes the way class differences fuel attraction and tension. For Connie, Paul embodies risk, the kind of risk her suburban life has systematically eliminated. For Paul, she represents a world of order and privilege he doesn't belong to. Their affair becomes an unspoken class collision, a meeting between the comfort of affluence and the hunger of artistic struggle. Lyne doesn't hammer this point. He lets it simmer in the background, woven into every gesture and glance. There's also an undercurrent of critique toward how modern relationships are shaped by routine and emotional neglect. The film doesn't present Connie's marriage as broken, but as quietly starved. She and Edward share affection, but it's mechanical, dulled by repetition. This depiction of emotional stagnation within marriage mirrors a broader social anxiety, that the pursuit of stability often comes at the cost of passion. The film doesn't celebrate adultery, but it uses it as a lens to examine what happens when love becomes maintenance instead of connection. Even the way Lyne handles guilt and secrecy speaks to a cultural obsession with appearances. The Carsons' attempts to hide the truth are driven less by moral reflection and more by the fear of public exposure. Their guilt isn't just private, it's social. They're terrified not only of what they've done but of what others might think. This fear underscores a key cultural theme. In a world built on perception, reputation often outweighs truth. The police investigation near the film's end adds another layer of commentary. The quiet interrogation scenes, the small-town gossip, the unspoken fear of scandal, all highlight how communities thrive on moral policing. The Carsons' crime isn't just about murder or adultery. It's about breaking the social script that keeps everyone else comfortable. Lyne frames this world as one where maintaining appearances is more sacred than seeking authenticity, a reflection of a culture obsessed with facade over feeling. There's also a broader existential question running through the film that ties it to its cultural moment, the fear of complacency. Unfaithful, 2002, is one of those rare films that doesn't just entertain its audience. It unsettles them, pulls them into its quiet chaos, and forces them to feel every pulse of emotion that runs through its characters. From the first time Diane Lane's Connie locks eyes with Olivier Martinez's Paul, viewers sense that something dangerous and magnetic is about to unfold. It's not a film that shouts for attention with explosions or spectacle. Instead, it seduces the audience slowly, luring them in with intimacy, guilt, and tension so thick it feels almost tactile. The emotional engagement starts small. Curiosity, intrigue, fascination, and then builds into something much more consuming. Every viewer becomes a kind of silent accomplice to Connie's choices. When she first meets Paul on that windy street corner, audiences lean in. When she enters his apartment filled with books and sunlight, there's a shared sense of anticipation. The film's pacing, visual rhythm, and sound design create a voyeuristic experience that's hard to look away from. Viewers find themselves feeling what Connie feels. The excitement, the fear, the adrenaline rush of doing something forbidden. It's an emotional ride that's less about judgment and more about recognition, because, at some point, everyone understands what it means to crave something that can't be had without consequence. Adrian Lyne crafts this engagement through silence as much as through action. Many of the most powerful scenes in Unfaithful aren't loud or dramatic. They're quiet, charged moments where the audience fills in the emotional blanks. When Connie rides the train after her first affair, replaying memories that flicker between ecstasy and guilt, the sequence becomes a mirror for the viewer's internal dialogue. People watching can't help but project themselves into her confusion. The montage doesn't tell them what to feel. It invites them to decide whether to condemn or empathize, whether to recoil or understand. That tension keeps audiences glued to the screen not because they're curious about what happens next, but because they're trying to figure out how they feel about what's already happened. The emotional engagement deepens once the story shifts from passion to consequence. When Edward discovers the affair, the film's tone changes, and so does the audience's relationship with it. What began as a seductive fantasy becomes a suffocating moral dilemma. Viewers start to oscillate between perspectives, feeling sympathy for Connie's loneliness, pity for Edward's heartbreak, and dread at the inevitability of collapse. The confrontation scene between Edward and Paul shocks audiences not only because of the sudden violence but because of the emotional eruption that precedes it. Lyne captures that moment in a way that feels disturbingly real. It's the release of every suppressed emotion, rage, humiliation, despair, that's been simmering beneath the surface. Audiences don't just witness it, they feel it viscerally, as if it's their own secret unraveling. One of the most fascinating aspects of Unfaithful is how it provokes divided reactions. Some viewers empathize with Connie's search for passion. Others feel betrayed by her selfishness. Some understand Edward's actions. Others recoil at them. That moral grayness is what keeps the film alive in post-viewing discussions. It doesn't hand audiences an easy stance. It challenges them to examine their own values, their own thresholds for forgiveness, their own hidden impulses. After watching, couples debate what they would do in the same situation. Audiences leave the theater or turn off the screen not with closure, but with questions. It's that discomfort that lingers, that keeps people talking about Unfaithful decades later. Lyne's mastery lies in knowing when to make the audience lean forward and when to make them squirm. He doesn't bombard them with melodrama. He seduces them with reality. Even simple gestures, Connie brushing her hair in the mirror after seeing Paul, Edward staring silently at his wife during dinner, carry emotional weight that makes viewers hold their breath. Every scene feels intimate, personal, as if the audience has been invited into a secret they shouldn't hear but can't resist listening to. That forbidden intimacy creates a bond between viewer and film that's hard to shake. The performances amplify this connection. Diane Lane's portrayal of Connie is so emotionally transparent that viewers can read her thoughts in every flicker of expression. When she smiles, it's not just joy, it's panic, relief, longing, and guilt all tangled together. The audience becomes her emotional shadow, feeling her heartbeat in sync with their own. Richard Gere's quiet pain draws empathy even in his silence. His slow unraveling commands sympathy without ever asking for it. That emotional duality makes the viewing experience feel like being torn in two, rooting for both of them even when they're at odds. What makes Unfaithful particularly engaging is how it turns the audience into emotional participants rather than observers. Every look, every secret, every lie pulls the viewer deeper into its web. The movie asks them to question their own moral boundaries. Would they forgive? Would they confess? Would they hide the truth? That moral participation transforms watching the film into something interactive, psychological. The story doesn't end when the credits roll because its tension stays lodged in the mind long after. Even the structure of the film encourages repeat viewing. On a first watch, audiences are swept up in the story's immediacy, the thrill of the affair, the dread of discovery, the shock of the ending. On a second viewing, they start to notice the details. The mirrored shots that reflect Connie's shifting identity, the way lighting changes as guilt creeps in, the subtle gestures between husband and wife that foreshadow the breakdown. It's a film that grows richer the more attention you give it, rewarding reflection and discussion rather than passive consumption. Another layer of audience engagement comes from the film's refusal to moralize. Instead of telling viewers what's right or wrong, it places them in the gray zone where love, guilt, and desire collide. That ambiguity makes the experience personal. Different people see different truths in it. Some see a tragedy of passion, others a cautionary tale about honesty, others still a critique of emotional emptiness in modern marriage. It's a movie that feels different depending on who you are and where you are in your own life, which makes it perennially engaging and emotionally alive. In moments of silence, when Connie stares at the broken snow globe, when Edward contemplates the weight of his decisions, audiences find themselves suspended between dread and empathy. These are the moments that elicit the strongest reactions, not because of spectacle, but because of emotional truth. The film's quiet intensity provokes reflection, not reaction. It doesn't manipulate with sentimentality, but earns every feeling through authenticity. By the time Unfaithful ends, audiences are left in a state of emotional exhaustion and fascination. They've been made to feel desire, guilt, fear, sorrow, and pity, all within 2 hours of restrained storytelling. The engagement isn't about plot twists or thrills. It's about resonance. It lingers because it makes viewers confront something deeply human: the fragility of love, the hunger for meaning, and the terrifying cost of choices made in moments of weakness. When comparing Unfaithful, 2002, to other films within its genre and director Adrian Lyne's body of work, it becomes immediately clear that it isn't just another erotic thriller. It's one of the most emotionally grounded and psychologically precise entries in a category often known for style over substance. Unlike many thrillers that thrive on sensationalism or scandal, Unfaithful operates in the quiet, dangerous spaces between passion and consequence. It sits comfortably among Lyne's earlier explorations of desire and moral collapse, films like Fatal Attraction, 1987, and Indecent Proposal, 1993. But what separates Unfaithful from those is its deliberate stillness, its refusal to sensationalize, and its intimate focus on interior emotion over external action. In Fatal Attraction, Lyne gave audiences a high-octane portrayal of obsession and revenge, a feverish morality tale where infidelity spiraled into horror. Unfaithful, on the other hand, trades that operatic energy for something more human and quietly devastating. It's not about punishment or madness. It's about the unbearable weight of guilt and the tragedy of losing connection. Where Fatal Attraction explodes outward, Unfaithful implodes inward. Lyne matures as a storyteller here, shifting his lens from the shock of betrayal to the silence that follows it, the unspoken wounds, the haunting looks, the ache of what's been lost. Compared to Indecent Proposal, another of Lyne's moral provocations about love, temptation, and ownership, Unfaithful feels far more personal. While Indecent Proposal examines love as a transactional dilemma, Unfaithful examines it as a psychological reckoning. It isn't interested in hypotheticals or social experiments. It's interested in the quiet chaos of the human heart. Both films share a fascination with how relationships crack under moral strain, but Unfaithful strips away the spectacle, focusing entirely on emotional authenticity. Lyne replaces philosophical debate with human silence, turning what could have been a simple affair drama into a study of conscience. When placed alongside other Hollywood infidelity dramas, like Closer, 2004, Eyes Wide Shut, 1999, or The English Patient, 1996, Unfaithful stands out for its restraint. Where Closer thrives on verbal confrontation and psychological warfare, Unfaithful is wordless and physical. It uses glances, pauses, and touches to communicate everything dialogue could never say. Eyes Wide Shut, with its dreamlike surrealism and allegorical tone, explores desire through abstraction, whereas Unfaithful keeps its feet on the ground, anchoring lust and guilt in a recognizable, painfully ordinary world. In that sense, Unfaithful feels more intimate. It's less a fantasy about desire and more a confession about how dangerous it can be when suppressed longing finds an outlet. Even when compared to European films that mine similar emotional territory, such as Claude Chabrol's La Femme Infidèle, 1969, which actually served as the inspiration for Unfaithful, Lyne's version feels both homage and evolution. Chabrol's original film, steeped in cold detachment and bourgeois critique, observes infidelity with a clinical eye. Lyne, by contrast, replaces Chabrol's irony with empathy. He modernizes the story for a culture that's both more liberated and more repressed, capturing the spiritual fatigue of early 21st century suburban life. His version doesn't judge the characters. It invites the audience to understand them, to feel their confusion rather than condemn it. This shift from critique to compassion is what gives Unfaithful its lasting emotional resonance. When compared to other American erotic thrillers of the 1990s and early 2000s, films like Body Heat, Basic Instinct, or Damage, Unfaithful seems almost minimalist. Those films are built on heightened style, noir sensibilities, and sharp-edged eroticism. Unfaithful, however, uses its sensuality as an emotional language rather than a spectacle. The sex scenes between Connie and Paul aren't choreographed fantasies. They're messy, breathless, and human. Lyne captures the awkward beauty of intimacy, turning the erotic into something psychologically revealing rather than exploitative. In that sense, Unfaithful redefines the genre by grounding it in realism. It takes the thrill out of the thriller and replaces it with something more haunting: emotional recognition. Thematically, Unfaithful also shares DNA with films like Blue Valentine 2010 and Revolutionary Road 2008, both of which examine the decay of love in domestic settings. While those later films delve into emotional disintegration through confrontation and despair, Unfaithful reaches its impact through restraint. It's about what's not said, what lingers between two people who once loved each other and no longer know how to bridge the distance between them. The suburban setting, which in other films might feel like background, becomes in Lyne's hands a metaphor for emotional confinement. In that sense, Unfaithful predicts the wave of intimate dramas that would later explore the loneliness hiding inside modern comfort. From a tonal perspective, Unfaithful also distinguishes itself from other Lyne films through its visual and emotional austerity. Whereas 9.5 Weeks is drenched in stylized eroticism, Unfaithful is grounded, almost muted. The lighting is natural, the settings feel lived in, the characters behave like people rather than archetypes. This realism makes every decision, every betrayal, every consequence feel personal. Lyne's visual polish remains, but here it's tempered by maturity. Less about provocation, more about understanding. The director uses his signature sensual aesthetic not to titillate but to illuminate emotion. Comparing Unfaithful to more recent infidelity dramas like Marriage Story, 2019, or The Lost Daughter, 2021, reveals just how ahead of its time Lyne's film was. It treats infidelity not as a moral failure but as an existential symptom, an expression of longing, frustration, and isolation. Its honesty about human contradiction feels startlingly modern even today. Where contemporary dramas often rely on verbal dissection or overt symbolism, Unfaithful accomplishes the same depth through visual storytelling, through lingering gazes, tactile surfaces, and unspoken guilt. In the broader context of erotic and domestic dramas, Unfaithful stands as a kind of bridge between eras. It inherits the sensual boldness of the late 20th century erotic thriller, but blends it with the emotional realism and ambiguity of modern relationship cinema. It's less concerned with shock and more interested in empathy. Rather than positioning itself as a cautionary tale or morality play, it becomes a meditation on what it means to feel alive in the midst of comfort, and how desire can both awaken and destroy. If one were to look across Lyne's entire career, Unfaithful arguably represents his most restrained and emotionally mature work. It carries his signature themes, temptation, moral conflict, passion, but filters them through the lens of quiet heartbreak rather than overt drama. In that sense, it's both the culmination of his stylistic evolution and a subtle redefinition of the erotic thriller genre itself. While many films before and after it have explored infidelity, few have done so with such emotional precision, visual grace, and psychological depth. Unfaithful doesn't compete with its predecessors. It transcends them, proving that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about the act of betrayal, but about the silence that follows it. Unfaithful, 2002, is a film rich with visual language, layered symbolism, and quietly recurring metaphors that deepen its emotional resonance and transform a simple story of infidelity into a study of desire, guilt, and moral consequence. Adrian Lyne, a director known for turning sensuality into psychology, constructs every image and detail with purpose. Nothing in this movie is accidental. Not the wind that first sweeps Connie into Paul's arms, not the mirrors that frame her guilt, not even the recurring play of light and shadow that divides her world into two incompatible halves. Beneath its surface realism, Unfaithful is a web of symbols that chart the emotional and spiritual disintegration of its characters. One of the most prominent metaphors appears in the film's opening moments. The windstorm. When Connie first encounters Paul, it's a day defined by chaos. Papers flying, hair whipping, a force of nature that literally knocks her off balance. The wind functions as both literal and symbolic disruption. It represents temptation, chance, and the uncontrollable pull of desire that sweeps into her orderly life. That gust of wind doesn't just introduce Paul. It signals the beginning of emotional turbulence, the first crack in Connie's carefully maintained stability. Throughout the film, weather continues to echo her emotional state. As the affair intensifies, sunlight and movement dominate. As guilt consumes her, the imagery turns overcast, enclosed, heavy. Lyne uses nature as emotional language. Storm as desire, stillness as repression, warmth as temptation, coldness as consequence. Mirrors and reflections serve as another powerful recurring motif. Connie is constantly framed within mirrors, glass, and reflective surfaces. Windows, train doors, shop fronts, even puddles. Each image subtly fractured, doubled, or distorted. This visual doubling underscores the central duality of her life. Wife and lover, mother and sinner, self and shadow. The reflection becomes a metaphor for her fractured identity. When she looks at herself after visiting Paul, she doesn't see the same woman she saw that morning. Lyne stages these moments with restraint, letting the audience sense her inner division without words. Even the camera mirrors her consciousness, smooth and fluid during the affair, tense and still once guilt sets in. The film becomes a visual diary of a woman torn between two selves. Trains emerge as one of the film's most evocative metaphors for temptation and transition. Every time Connie boards a train from the suburbs to the city, she's crossing a psychological border. The train is both a vehicle and a symbol, a liminal space where morality blurs, where she sheds one identity and adopts another. The rhythmic motion of the train mirrors her pulse, her anticipation, her guilt. In the iconic sequence where she replays memories of her first encounter with Paul, the train becomes her conscience on rails, carrying her through waves of ecstasy and remorse. The repeated imagery of travel suggests that infidelity is not just an act but a journey, a crossing into forbidden emotional territory from which there's no true return. The snow globe that reappears throughout the film is perhaps the most haunting metaphor of all. It sits in the Carson home as an innocent decoration, a symbol of domestic perfection, a frozen, idealized world encased in glass. After the violent confrontation, when Edward's guilt and Connie's secrets converge, the snow globe shatters, literally and metaphorically. The broken glass represents the destruction of that illusion of safety, the end of the fragile world they built together. Its contents, a small, idyllic village, echo their suburban life, now irreparably fractured. The snow globe becomes the film's visual thesis. Perfection is beautiful only until life's chaos seeps in. Once cracked, it can never be made whole again. The recurring use of stairs and thresholds also carries deep symbolic weight. Lyne frequently places Connie and Edward at doorways, staircases, and corridors, spaces that suggest transition, hesitation, and moral in-betweenness. Connie's first ascent up Paul's loft stairs is filmed almost ritualistically, as if she's entering a temple of temptation. Each step is a choice, a surrender. Later, when Edward descends into the basement to conceal the murder weapon, the symmetry is chilling. One climbs towards sin, the other descends into guilt. The house itself becomes a symbolic map of their emotional descent, from bright kitchens of family comfort to the shadowed corners where secrets hide. Light and color play an equally central role in shaping the film's metaphors. Lyne contrasts two distinct palettes: the warm, amber glow of Connie's encounters with Paul and the cool, blue-gray tones of her home life. The warm hues evoke sensuality and danger, a world alive with texture and impulse, while the cooler ones embody repression and order. As the narrative progresses, these palettes begin to merge and clash. The golden light fades from Paul's loft, replaced by shadow and tension. The once cool suburban interiors become darker, claustrophobic. The visual blending of color mirrors the moral blurring in Connie's conscience. Lyne's lighting choices aren't just aesthetic, they're emotional maps, charting her psychological shift from passion to panic. Books, too, function as subtle but telling symbols. Paul's loft is cluttered with them, towering stacks lining the walls like monuments to knowledge and curiosity. His world, chaotic but stimulating, contrasts sharply with Connie's neatly ordered home. Books become a metaphor for freedom and exploration, the intellectual and emotional curiosity Connie has suppressed in her domestic life. When she touches the books, it's as if she's touching an entire world of experiences she's been denied. Their presence adds depth to Paul's allure. He's not just a lover, but a symbol of the unknown, of untamed possibility. Even the film's treatment of physical touch carries metaphorical meaning. The intimacy between Connie and Paul is filmed in fragmented close-ups, hands on skin, lips brushing, breath mingling. These tactile images contrast with the restrained, distant physicality between Connie and Edward. Touch becomes a language of truth. Where words lie or conceal, touch reveals. As guilt sets in, Connie begins to avoid contact with her husband, as if her body itself holds confession. The affair isn't just physical. It rewires her relationship to touch, making her body a vessel of memory and shame. Glass, another recurring motif, symbolizes both transparency and fragility. Whether it's the glass table where Edward later hides the snow globe or the windows through which characters gaze, glass represents the boundary between appearance and reality. It allows visibility but denies contact, a metaphor for the emotional barriers between husband and wife. The shattering of glass at key moments, like the broken snow globe or the faint reflection of Connie's tears on the train window, signals moments when that barrier collapses and truth breaks through illusion. The city itself functions as a living metaphor. Manhattan, with its energy and unpredictability, contrasts sharply with the pristine stillness of Westchester. Unfaithful, 2002, doesn't belong to a cinematic franchise, but its historical and cultural context within early 2000s Hollywood makes it a fascinating case study in how cinema reflects the moral anxieties and emotional turbulence of its time. Directed by Adrian Lyne, whose earlier works like Fatal Attraction and Indecent Proposal had already cemented his reputation as the master of erotic moral drama, Unfaithful stands as both a continuation of his thematic universe and a commentary on shifting social and cinematic sensibilities. To understand its place in film history, it helps to view it as a modern evolution of the post-80s adultery thriller, a genre obsessed with the collision between passion, guilt, and domestic illusion. The early 2000s were a transitional period for Hollywood. The sleek erotic thrillers that had dominated the 1980s and 1990s were fading, replaced by more psychological and introspective narratives. Audiences had become less interested in shock and spectacle, craving instead emotional authenticity and moral ambiguity. Unfaithful emerged at that crossroads, carrying the DNA of the erotic thriller but infusing it with the sensibility of a modern drama. Where Fatal Attraction treated infidelity as punishment and spectacle, Unfaithful approached it as quiet tragedy, messy, human, and painfully real. Lyne, revisiting familiar territory, stripped away the genre sensationalism and replaced it with domestic intimacy, transforming the film into a reflection on conscience and consequence in an age increasingly obsessed with appearances. Historically, Unfaithful can be seen as part of a long lineage of cinematic explorations of infidelity, stretching back to classics like Brief Encounter, 1945, The Apartment, 1960, and The Bridges of Madison County, 1995. Each of these films captured the cultural pulse of their time: wartime restraint, post-war cynicism, or Midwestern longing. Unfaithful represents the suburban unease of the post-9/11 era. It's not just a story about an affair. It's a story about the fragility of the American ideal. The carefully maintained suburban dream, perfect home, happy marriage, secure family, is portrayed as something that can shatter as easily as the snow globe that becomes the film's metaphorical centerpiece. In that sense, Unfaithful speaks to a historical moment of vulnerability, when the illusions of safety and perfection felt particularly fragile. Adrian Lyne's work also connects Unfaithful to a broader historical thread in film history: the tension between eroticism and morality. In the 1980s, Lyne and contemporaries like Paul Verhoeven, Basic Instinct, and Alan Parker, Angel Heart, pushed Hollywood boundaries by blending sexuality with suspense. By 2002, that genre had matured or perhaps aged. Lyne adapted to the moment by making a quieter, more intimate film, less about lust and more about the psychological aftermath of desire. In doing so, Unfaithful serves as a bridge between the glossy erotic thrillers of the past and the introspective adult dramas that would follow, like Little Children, 2006, and Revolutionary Road, 2008. Interestingly, Unfaithful itself is a loose remake of the 1969 French film La Femme Infidèle by Claude Chabrol, a master of domestic suspense. This connection situates Lyne's film within a distinctly European cinematic tradition, one less concerned with punishment and more attuned to moral nuance. Chabrol's original was understated and psychological, using infidelity to expose bourgeois hypocrisy. Lyne reinterprets that sensibility for American audiences, amplifying the emotion, sensuality, and visual poetry while retaining the moral unease. The transatlantic lineage of the story reveals how themes of betrayal and conscience transcend cultural boundaries, adapting with each era's tone and temperament. In terms of period authenticity, while Unfaithful is set in contemporary New York and Westchester rather than a historical past, it captures early 2000s America with a kind of quiet precision. The world it depicts, a comfortable middle-class suburban existence framed by cell phones, trains, and coffee shops, feels distinctly anchored in its time. The film's aesthetic reflects that early digital age's unease with connection and privacy. Before social media exposed everything, Unfaithful explored the dread of private lives unraveling beneath polished surfaces. The film's mood, the soft lighting, the minimalist interiors, the muted colors, evokes the aesthetic of turn-of-the-century realism, when domestic dramas began to trade glamour for psychological authenticity. Viewed against the backdrop of Lyne's career, Unfaithful also represents a culmination of his ongoing fascination with moral duality and emotional transgression. In 9.5 Weeks, 1986, he explored erotic obsession. In Fatal Attraction, 1987, he dramatized the consequences of temptation. In Indecent Proposal, 1993, he dissected love's commodification. Unfaithful ties these threads together, yet instead of sensationalizing desire, it humanizes it. Historically, it stands as the quiet epilogue to a cinematic era where passion and punishment were inseparable. In Lyne's world, sin isn't punished by death, it's punished by memory. The film's subtle realism also speaks to early 21st century social anxieties about gender and morality. By focusing on a woman's perspective, Unfaithful broke from the male-centric narratives that dominated the genre. It dared to show female desire not as aberration but as yearning, a radical notion in mainstream American cinema of that time. Historically, this shift aligned with broader cultural conversations about female agency, sexuality, and the double standards embedded in marriage narratives. Connie's journey, torn between passion and guilt, reflects a moment in film history when female characters began to reclaim complexity, no longer defined solely by virtue or transgression. Even the film's moral landscape reflects the cultural sensibilities of its time. Unlike the moral absolutism of the 1980s, the early 2000s were steeped in ambiguity. Audiences had grown more skeptical of black and white morality, craving nuance and realism. Unfaithful mirrored that evolution. There are no villains here, only choices and consequences. The husband is neither saint nor victim, the lover neither predator nor fantasy. That moral grayness, so unsettling in its realism, marks the film's historical significance. It belongs to an era when American cinema began to embrace emotional truth over moral clarity. From a broader historical perspective, Unfaithful also captures the fading glamour of the erotic thriller as Hollywood pivoted toward blockbuster franchises and fantasy escapism. In a decade dominated by The Lord of the Rings, Spider-Man, and Harry Potter, Unfaithful felt like an artifact from another age. A film made for adults about adults, unhurried, emotionally literate, and psychologically rich. Its success at the box office proved that there was still appetite for stories of intimacy and consequence, even as the cinematic mainstream turned elsewhere. Finally, the film's place in cultural memory underscores its historical resonance. While Unfaithful may not belong to a literal franchise, it forms part of a spiritual one, Adrian Lyne's unofficial canon of desire, guilt, and consequence. Each of his films feels like a chapter in a moral saga exploring how love and temptation test human integrity. When it comes to the financial side of Unfaithful, 2002, the story behind the numbers is as fascinating as the film itself. A reminder that passion, guilt, and betrayal aren't the only high-stakes games in town. Hollywood's box office is one too. With a production budget of around $50 million, Unfaithful was by no means a small, indie drama. It was a major studio project backed by 20th Century Fox, carrying the glossy sheen and precision craftsmanship that director Adrian Lyne had become known for. Every cent of that budget shows up on screen, not in explosions or CGI, but in the film's polish. The perfectly designed suburban home, the sleek Manhattan apartment, the softly lit cinematography, and the meticulous pacing that gives each scene a sensual and unsettling texture. The film's production value feels elevated, and it's clear that Lyne and his team knew how to make a modestly budgeted drama look luxurious and cinematic. Filming took place largely in and around New York City and suburban Westchester County, both of which carry notoriously high production costs. But those choices were deliberate. Lyne didn't want generic backdrops. He wanted authenticity, texture, a world that felt lived in but aspirational. Every location looks like it belongs to a real family, yet also to a fantasy version of domestic life. The interiors are rich with detail. Books, muted tones, textures of wood and glass, that communicate wealth and comfort without overt showiness. That kind of realism costs money because it requires art direction, careful lighting and time. The film's measured pace and emphasis on performance meant more shooting days and more attention to subtle visual transitions, which are never cheap to achieve. So, while the film's budget wasn't astronomical by early 2000 standards, it was carefully allocated to ensure visual and emotional richness that matched Lyne's signature style. When Unfaithful hit theaters in May 2002, it opened in a market that was in flux. Big-budget franchises were beginning to dominate the box office, and intimate adult dramas were becoming a rarer sight among the summer lineups. Yet, despite that competitive landscape, the film turned out to be a surprising commercial success. It grossed over $119 million worldwide, more than doubling its production budget, a solid return that proved there was still an audience hungry for mature storytelling. Domestic box office numbers crossed $52 million, while international markets contributed a significant $67 million, signaling that the universal themes of desire, guilt, and moral conflict resonated well beyond American borders. The marketing for Unfaithful was cleverly tailored to tap into both curiosity and controversy. The trailers and posters leaned heavily on the tension between passion and danger, selling the movie not as a traditional domestic drama, but as a psychological thriller with erotic overtones. Taglines like, "Where do you go when you've gone too far?" framed the film as a forbidden journey rather than a moral lesson. That kind of marketing not only appealed to fans of Adrian Lyne's earlier hits like Fatal Attraction and Indecent Proposal, but also drew in a younger adult audience intrigued by the promise of an intense, stylish experience. What worked especially well was the balance. The campaign didn't oversell the sexual content, which might have alienated more conservative viewers, but it hinted just enough to spark curiosity. Another factor in the film's box office performance was word of mouth, which spread quickly after its release. Critics were divided. Some praised the film's craftsmanship and Diane Lane's powerhouse performance, while others found its pacing deliberately slow, but audiences were captivated. The talk wasn't just about the story. It was about the raw emotion, the realism, and above all Lane's mesmerizing portrayal of a woman torn between two worlds. Her performance became the emotional anchor of the film, and it paid off commercially when she received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. That Oscar buzz extended the movie's theatrical life, pulling in viewers who might have missed it during its initial run. Financially, Unfaithful hit a sweet spot that many adult dramas fail to achieve. It wasn't a runaway blockbuster, but it didn't need to be. Its success was rooted in smart budgeting, disciplined storytelling, and precise audience targeting. Unlike special effects-heavy productions that depend on massive international markets, Unfaithful relied on something much rarer: repeat viewings driven by emotional connection. Viewers returned to re-experience the tension, the subtle performances, and the haunting sense of moral unease. That kind of engagement gives a film a longer tail at the box office and contributes to its enduring profitability through home video and television rights. In terms of production economics, the film also benefited from Lyne's disciplined filmmaking style. Known for his visual precision, he avoided costly reshoots or extravagant set pieces. Most scenes are contained within a few key locations, allowing the crew to control lighting, sound, and timing with minimal logistical chaos. Even so, the film looks expensive because of how it's shot. Every frame feels composed like a painting, every light source carefully chosen to evoke mood rather than just illuminate. That's where the artistry meets the budget, It's not about spending more, it's about spending wisely. Another layer of the film's financial story is its longevity. While Unfaithful made impressive numbers in theaters, its second life on DVD, television, and later digital platforms turned it into an enduring asset for the studio. Erotic dramas often perform well in home markets, where viewers seek intimacy and slow-burn tension at their own pace. The film's themes and craftsmanship made it a strong performer in that arena, and it became a regular fixture on cable movie channels and streaming catalogs, ensuring long-term profitability. The audience reception also helped shape the film's legacy as more than just a mid-budget adult thriller. It reminded Hollywood that adult-oriented storytelling, films about emotion, morality, and inner conflict, could still succeed in a marketplace obsessed with spectacle. Unfaithful's box office success encouraged studios to greenlight similar projects in the early 2000s, even if few matched its balance of artistry and accessibility. In hindsight, its financial performance feels almost prophetic. It was one of the last times a sensual psychological drama could claim box office glory before the blockbuster era fully took over. From a purely business perspective, Unfaithful was a textbook example of calculated risk paying off. A $50 million drama about infidelity doesn't sound like a guaranteed hit, but with the right cast, direction, and marketing, it became both critically respected and commercially viable. The film's success can be traced to its perfect blend of star power, restrained spectacle, and emotional relatability. Every dollar spent contributed directly to what audiences saw and felt. The authenticity of the locations, the quiet luxury of the set design, the refined cinematography, and the seamless tension in editing. In the grand financial landscape of early 2000 cinema, Unfaithful stood as a reminder that audiences would still pay for well-crafted stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary emotions. If you're ready to dive into the seductive tension and moral unraveling of Unfaithful, 2002, the good news is that this film is easier to access today than ever before. While it's no longer showing in theaters, its legacy lives strong across major digital and streaming platforms, ensuring that both new audiences and longtime fans can experience its slow-burn intensity in all its visual and emotional depth. The movie is currently available for streaming on platforms like Hulu, Amazon Prime Video through subscription or digital rental, Apple TV, YouTube Movies, Google Play, and Vudu, where you can rent or purchase it in HD. Depending on your region, it may also pop up on networks like FX or Paramount Channel, which occasionally feature early 2000s thrillers and drama reruns. Because Unfaithful isn't a spectacle-driven movie that demands a theatrical screen, it thrives in the intimacy of a living room viewing, where its quiet tension and emotional precision can unfold without distraction. The best way to experience Unfaithful is in a calm, uninterrupted setting. Dim the lights, silence your phone, and let Adrian Lyne's meticulous visual storytelling pull you in. This is a film that rewards attentiveness. The camera lingers, the silences speak volumes, and every glance between characters builds a kind of emotional electricity that's easy to miss if you're multitasking. Watching it on a large TV or home theater setup allows you to fully appreciate the film's soft, painterly lighting and the careful framing that defines Lyne's aesthetic. The cinematography is layered with textures, the glow of afternoon sunlight across a wooden table, the reflection of rain on a city street, the subtle play of shadows across faces, that feel immersive when viewed in high definition. If you prefer physical media, the Blu-ray release of Unfaithful remains a must-have for collectors and cinephiles. It includes behind-the-scenes features and commentary that provide fascinating insight into how Lyne builds tension through visual restraint and rhythm. The physical edition also gives the film a richer, crisper presentation than some streaming versions, especially in the darker, moodier scenes where shadow detail is essential. Watching on Blu-ray also preserves the original widescreen composition, letting the viewer appreciate how space and framing contribute to the storytelling. How the distance between characters in the same frame visually mirrors the emotional distance growing between them. For those discovering the film for the first time, Unfaithful works best when approached not as background entertainment but as an experience. It's a slow, psychological immersion, more about atmosphere than plot twists, more about tone than spectacle. The pacing is deliberate, and the tension grows in quiet, domestic spaces. So, Whether you're streaming it solo on a laptop late at night or watching it on a large screen in your living room, give it your full attention. The quieter you make your surroundings, the louder its emotional undercurrents will feel. Every sigh, creak, and pause in dialogue carries meaning, and that nuance can only be appreciated when you're fully tuned in. Streaming platforms have also given Unfaithful new life with enhanced audio quality, which is vital for appreciating its subtle sound design. The film's soundscape, rustling leaves, train hums, the low murmur of conversation, forms a kind of invisible character that reinforces mood and emotion. A good sound system or even a pair of quality headphones can make a surprising difference, turning the experience from passive watching into full sensory involvement. The film's score, with its restrained yet evocative instrumentation, sounds especially haunting when heard in high fidelity, underscoring the tension that coils beneath every scene. For those outside the United States, availability may vary. In some regions, Unfaithful is hosted on local streaming services like Netflix UK, Disney Plus Hotstar, or Amazon Prime regional libraries. It occasionally appears on subscription-based movie platforms like Mubi or MGM Plus, particularly in collections celebrating psychological dramas or erotic thrillers of the early 2000s. Checking your country's digital libraries or local television networks can reveal surprise broadcasts, as the film remains a popular choice for late-night slots and thematic marathons exploring love, betrayal, and consequence. If you want the most immersive version possible, consider watching the film with the original English audio track rather than a dubbed version. The nuances in Diane Lane's voice, the tremor of guilt, the whisper of longing, the breaking of control, are part of what make her performance so magnetic. Similarly, Richard Gere's soft-spoken restraint carries layers of suppressed emotion that can be lost in translation. Subtitles can help, but the original performances are calibrated so finely that the film's emotional precision truly comes alive when you hear it as intended. Another underrated way to experience Unfaithful is during a quiet evening rewatch, when you already know what happens but can focus entirely on the micro-details. The way a scene is lit, how a pause lasts a second too long, how a reflection in a mirror hints at the duplicity of desire. On repeat viewing, the film transforms. What felt like simple scenes during a first watch now pulse with subtext, and you begin to appreciate Adrian Lyne's control over rhythm and mood even more. In today's streaming landscape, Unfaithful has found renewed appreciation among viewers who missed it during its theatrical run. The convenience of on-demand access means it can now be discovered by audiences too young to have experienced the early 2000s era of adult psychological dramas in theaters. And unlike many films of that period, it holds up remarkably well because it doesn't rely on outdated technology or stylized gimmicks. It thrives on universal human emotion, timeless moral tension, and that unmistakable line blend of sensuality and restraint. Ultimately, where and how you watch Unfaithful shapes the kind of experience you have. In a crowded space with distractions, it's just a story about an affair gone wrong. But in the right atmosphere, quiet, focused, unhurried, it becomes something much more hypnotic and personal, a mirror reflecting the fragility of trust and the danger of desire. Whether you rent it digitally, stream it through a subscription, or own the Blu-ray, this is a film best savored slowly, like a confession whispered in the dark. Intimate, haunting, and impossible to forget.